Enigmatic, secretive, proud. These are the words most often used to describe the Dwemer, and while they are not wrong, they are not enough. The Dwemer were a people who looked upon the gods and saw only questions to be answered. A civilization that heard the music underlying all of reality and decided that they could compose a better song. An entire race that vanished in a single heartbeat, leaving behind kingdoms of brass and mysteries that thousands of years of study have failed to unravel. We cannot visit them. We cannot speak with them. We can only imagine. Imagine the great halls of Nechardak or Muzulft in their prime, not the age-old ruins we wander today, but living cities of steam-fueled pistons and clockwork constructs. Feel what it must have been like to walk those corridors when they hummed with purpose, when every pipe carried heat, when every gear turned in service of designs we can no longer comprehend. Imagine councils of Dwemeri architects stroking their jeweled beards as they celebrate the awakening of their marvelous machines, each with its own purpose in their grand schematics for civilization. Think of the Snow Elves, humbled before the Dwemer who remained their only smug salvation when the Nordic terror arrived at their shores. Imagine Kagrenac, High Craftlord and Chief Tonal Architect, standing before his peers with plans that would make other Mer weep with terror or reverence. Plans for a god of brass, a mechanical divinity that would elevate the Dwemer beyond mortality itself. And imagine the end. Kaima and Dwemer locked in a war that would determine the fate of Resdayn, Nerevar and his generals descending into the mountain, fighting towards the heart chamber, true flame ignited in righteous fury, splitting dwarven helms, the molten brass folding inward, searing the flesh beneath. Then, Dumak Dwarf King falling, his friendship with Nerevar shattered beyond repair. Imagine Kagrenac, surrounded by enemies, reaching for his tools one final time. Did they scream? Did they have time to understand what was happening? Did parents reach for their children? We do not know. In that instant, every Dwemer on Tamriel vanished. Not died, vanished. The soldiers beneath Red Mountain, the colonists in distant Hammerfell, the miners in Blackreach. Gone. The Dwemer are, without question, one of the most discussed subjects in Elder Scrolls lore, and for good reason. Every answer breeds two more questions. Every thread leads deeper into tangles we may never unravel. Bethesda has maintained that the Dwemer's ultimate fate will remain a mystery. Some questions are meant to stay unanswered. I can respect that, but I believe we can do more than shrug and call it unknowable. My name is Scott, welcome to Fudge Muppet, and while the Dwemer are far more complicated than you might think, I am certain we can find meaning in their mystery. We shall partake in a definitive exploration of the Deep Elves, from their mysterious origins to their revolutionary philosophy to the doom that claimed them. So let us begin where all good histories begin, at the beginning, or rather, at the problem of beginnings, because when it comes to the Dwemer, even the question of where they came from has no simple answer. The disappearance of the Dwemer is rigorously discussed in all corners of the community. Theories multiply like mushrooms in the dark, each competing to definitively explain where the Dwemer went, or perhaps what they became. But there is an older question, one I see far less examined, and that is the mystery of where these curious elves came from in the first place. Most races of elves can account for their presence on Tamriel as one instance in a long history of migration from the Somerset Isles, perhaps only with the exception of the Falmer and the Dwemer. The Altmora, the High Elves, certainly present this idea as truth in their ideology. According to them, they maintained a civilization closest to the ancients and are themselves the purest form of elf, closest to the original Aldmeri. The others, be it Ayleid, Kaima, Durrani, Bosmer, these races are considered cousins who have drifted in both culture and ethnicity. Most Elven races recognize their origin in Somerset. Some of the Bosmer descent, their Spinner traditions hold that they were once a primordial ooze, given stable forms by Ifri, and hence have always lived in Valenwood. But this is the exception that proves the rule. When we turn to the Falmer and the Dwemer, we find something different. Silence. Little of their cultural stories remain, both civilizations having been lost, the Falmer destroyed, and the Dwemer vanished during the early First Era. One thing is certain, no one knows for sure where the Dwemer came from or where they went, and today we've been fortunate enough to have a sponsor for this massive deep dive that allows you to create the same kind of mystery online. NordVPN lets you pull off a total vanishing act of your own by changing your IP address, letting you fast travel through servers in countries all over the world, making your online activity untraceable. Not even Nord stores it. In addition to encrypting your traffic, you can use NordVPN to stream content from around the globe at home and use the subscriptions you pay for even when you travel. Recently, I used NordVPN to change my IP address to rewatch Gladiator on Netflix, as well as Django Unchained, which I couldn't access in Australia. NordVPN Plus comes with a kind of digital armor called Threat Protection Pro, which detects at least 85% of phishing websites by blocking them before they can deal damage, and flat out blocks websites containing malware, even scanning and removing any harmful files you download before they can impair your device. It even warns you if you're about to visit a scam store, which are only getting more common. So whether you're deep diving into the disappearance of an entire race or just browsing the web, don't let your data be plundered like a forgotten ruin. Get a huge discount plus 4 extra months of NordVPN for free with a 2-year plan by clicking our link in the description or using code FudgeMuppet at checkout. They even have a 30-day money-back guarantee and let you protect up to 10 devices with one account, so you can try it today, risk-free. Now let us dive into the mystery of the Dwemer's origins to examine what explanations exist and whether any of them hold up to scrutiny. Resdayn, as the land of Morrowind was once known, was the earliest home of the Dwemer, at least as far as any records go. The Dwemer would later spread their civilization across the north of Tamriel into Skyrim and Hammerfell, and they were most certainly spreading from the east, from the land we now know as Morrowind. Several historians attempt to fill in the gaps, perhaps citing what could be considered the simplest of explanations. First, we can look to the works of the Imperial Geographical Society, specifically the Third Pocket Guide to the Empire. Apparently, not even this esteemed society can agree on the case of Dwemer origins within their own publication. From the Somerset Isles section. According to the traditions of Somerset, the Aldmer who went to be free on the mainland became all the disparate elven folk of history. Kaimer, Bosmer, Aeliad. The ones who stayed behind became the Altmer. Even the earliest records of Somerset, however, shed no light on the origins of the Dwemer, who already occupied the northeast of Tamriel when Veloth and his people arrived there. And from the Morrowind section, the earliest civilization of which there are records is that of the Dwemer. Sometimes called dwarves by the ignorant, the Dwemer were the remnants of the early Aldmer who had settled the coasts and developed a highly sophisticated and technological culture. The Pocket Guide itself cannot decide whether the Dwemer's origins are unknowable or simply a matter of Aldmeri settlement. This contradiction appears within the same text. The claim made in the Morrowind section, however, aligns with what is stated in Before the Ages of Man. During the Middle Merethic era, Aldmeri explorers mapped the coasts of Vvardenfell, building the First Era High Elven wizard towers at Old Redania, Balfell, Telarun, and Telmora in Morrowind. It was also during this period that Aeliad settlements flourished in the jungles surrounding White Gold Tower. These high elven wizard towers are cited as the first elven presence in this land. If we move forward in the timeline, the next elven civilization that appears is the Dwemer. Put 2 and 2 together and we might surmise that these ancient Aldmer who settled on the coasts would later develop into the Dwemer civilization. If I wanted to lend additional credence to this idea, I could also cite the unique Dwemer architecture of Resdayn, particularly the unique pointy tower appearance, which could perhaps hold echoes of a classic wizard tower design. Between these two texts, we could find support for the idea that the Dwemer are some peculiarly advanced offshoots of Aldmeri settlers, but as you might think, there are reasons to doubt this lineage. Let us consider the authors and place these texts in time. The 3rd edition Pocket Guide was written during the late reign of Uriel Septim VII and likely inherits its evidence from Before the Ages of Man, dated centuries earlier. But here is the problem. The Pocket Guide contradicts itself. Its 2 statements about the Dwemer cannot be reconciled. You cannot simultaneously claim that even the earliest records of Somerset do not account for the Dwemer, and yet also they claim they were the remnants of the early Aldmer who settled the coasts. This is likely the result of multiple authors working on different sections of the Pocket Guide, but it should give us pause about treating either claim as definitive. The earlier source, before the Ages of Man, was written by Icantar of Shimmerine, the Sapiarch of Indoctrination for the First Aldmeri Dominion, who lived in the Second Era during the Three Banners War. His role was quite literally to shape ideological narratives, and while Icantar does not explicitly claim the Dwemer descended from Aldmeri explorers in his book, his account of Tamriel's migrations and the sighting of the supposed Aldmeri towers provides the evidence that the Imperial Geographical Society later used to reach that conclusion. There is a smaller point worth noting. The 4 sites that Icantar names as High Elven Wizard Towers, Old Redania, Balfell, Telarun and Telmora, bear no trace of Aldmeri construction. Walk these sites in the Third Era and you will find only Velothi towers built by the Kaimer, Daedric ruins dedicated to the profane worship that no Aldmeri explorer would have sanctioned, and Telvanni mushroom spires grown by Dunmer wizard lords thousands of years after any supposed settlement. If High Elven towers once stood at these sites, not a single stone remains. Not a foundation, not an artifact, nothing. Nor is there any explanation for why the Aldmeri settlers, if they were to become Dwemer, would overhaul their society so drastically, abandoning faith in the gods and living in underground cities, in stark contrast to their previous Aldmeri culture. To be as charitable as I can here, these towers are designated as wizard towers, and perhaps it was a subculture of reclusive, arrogant Aldmer wizards separated from the core culture of Alinor by vast seas and miles of land, that eventually turned into the isolated, intellectual Dwemer that we know of. It is possible Icantar was recording genuine tradition, that Aldmeri towers did exist at these locations and were simply destroyed over millennia, but given the Altmeri tendency to claim all Elven cultures as offshoots of their own pure lineage, we should be skeptical. The Elves of Somerset do not merely record history, they curate it to serve ideological purposes. Icantar goes on to explain in this book, the late Merethic era marks the precipitous decline of Velothi culture. Some Velothi settled in villages near declining and abandoned ancient Velothi towers. During this period, Velothi high culture disappeared on Vardenfell Island. The earliest Dwemer freehold colonies date from this period. Degenerate Velothi devolved into tribal cultures which, in time, evolved into the modern Great Houses of Morrowind, or persisted as the barbarian Ashlander tribes. Icantar's timeline contradicts itself somewhat. It places the earliest Dwemer freehold colonies in the late Merethic era, after the Velothi had already arrived and degenerated into tribal cultures. Yet earlier in the text he writes, despising the secular culture and profane practices of the Dwemer, the Kaimer also coveted the lands and resources of the Dwemer and for centuries provoked them with minor raids and territorial disputes. For centuries, the Dwemer were not latecomers to Resdayn, they were already there when Veloth's people arrived, already entrenched, already building. Icantar's freehold colonies must refer to expansion, not origin. Icantar also claims the First Era High Elven Wizard Towers were abandoned at this time. This must be simply an error on his part, since we are still talking about events well within the Merethic era at this point. And by the late Merethic, what stood at Old Redania and Balfell was Velothi, not Aldmeri. If High Elven towers ever existed at those sites, they were gone long before the period Icantar describes. There are issues with this book, and they are not exclusive to its sections about Resdayn. Consider this passage. It was in the late Merethic era that pre-literate humans, the so-called Nedic peoples from the continent of Atmora, also Altmora, or the Elderwood in Aldmeris, migrated and settled in northern Tamriel. I have discussed the problems with the out of Atmora migration theory at length in our video on the Forsworn, but the short version is this. Archaeological evidence suggests humans inhabited Tamriel far earlier than Icantar's timeline allows, and they were more advanced than he lets on. The Kothringi of Blackmarsh, the Needs of Cyrodiil, these people have roots that may predate Elven arrival entirely. Icantar's claim that humans were pre-literate late arrivals is not history but propaganda, designed to affirm Elven supremacy and claim over Tamriel. His biases become clearer still when we examine his other works, propaganda pieces for the Aldmeri Dominion. From the text, Welcome to New Aldmeri Irregulars. Then came the Dragon Break. That catastrophe was entirely the fault of men, but the Altmer had to repair it. Our good queen had no choice but to form the Aldmeri Dominion to conquer Cyrodiil, and ensure for the good of all who dwell in Nirn that men never again tamper with forces beyond their comprehension and competence. Only the Aldmeri, the High Elves and their noble allies, the Wood Elves and Catmen, have the wisdom and restraint to peaceably rule the disparate peoples of Tamriel. Though we are reluctant to take up this burden, events have shown that we must. This is not a neutral scholar, but an ideologue, and when an ideologue tells you that a mysterious, vanished race was really just a branch of his own people all along, we should ask what purpose that claim serves. Perhaps I'm not being entirely fair here. After all, Arkthzand himself does not explicitly say that the Dwemer are descended from the Aldmeri settlers. The Imperial Geographical Society makes that claim using his text, but the next Elven society to appear in Resdayn, according to his chronology of Tamrielic migration, is the Dwemer, and considering Arkthzand was the sapiarch of indoctrination for the first Aldmeri Dominion, I get the feeling he would agree with the Dwemer descended from Aldmeri settlers narrative. But knowing that his text, Before the Ages of Man, has several inconsistencies, the fact that his job is indoctrination for the Aldmeri Dominion, and that the Imperial Geographical Society can't make its mind up, the whole theory begins to look less like history and more like wishful thinking. But let's press on, because there is a far more interesting possibility to explore. There are two elven races of northern Tamriel that, mostly due to their extinct nature, leave us with many questions unanswered. These are the Dwemer, of course, but also the Falmer, the Snow Elves. These two races had quite an interesting relationship, the degeneration of the latter caused by the former. But most importantly, for the moment, the presence of the Falmer helps us better determine a timeline of Dwemer history. I imagine most of you have played Skyrim, and you will have come into contact with the degenerated Snow Elf race often found inhabiting ancient Dwemer cities of Nirn's depths. To clarify, Falmer and Snow Elf mean the same thing, but Falmer has come to connote the modern fallen race, whereas Snow Elf has come to refer to their precursors.
I prefer Snow Elf. The name Falmer usually holds a negative meaning to most travelers. Those twisted creatures you call Falmer, I call the Betrayed.
The story is well known. Ysgramor and his 500 companions came to avenge the sacking of Sarthal, and they slaughtered every snow elf they could find. Desperate for salvation, the Falmer turned to the Dwemer and their underground strongholds for protection. The Dwemer agreed, on the condition that their race must be blinded.
We had always maintained an uneasy alliance with the underground-dwelling dwarves, and when faced with extinction, we turned to them for help. Surprisingly, they agreed to protect us, but demanded a terrible price: the blinding of our race. There were splinter groups that resisted the agreement, and even some that sought alternate alliances. But when it was all said and done, those elves were either slaughtered, vanished, or gave up and took the dwarves' bargain.
But what does this tell us about the Dwemer? Firstly, it places Dwemer expansion into Skyrim earlier than previously thought by scholars such as Noramo. Ysgramor's arrival would likely have been between ME 500 and ME 200, meaning 5 to 200 years before the start of the First Era. I gave a full explanation of this estimate in our Falmer video linked in the description, but with this said, it means Dwemer freeholds must have expanded into modern-day Skyrim by this period. Blackreach and many of the great Dwemer cities of subterranean Skyrim would have been established at this time, because if they were not, how would the Falmer flee to refuge with the Dwemer? So westward expansion of the Dwemer of Resdayn had at least begun by the late Merethic era, and so now I want to propose a theory that I find quite compelling, though I acknowledge it remains speculative. What if the Falmer and the Dwemer were related? What if, like I speculated in the Falmer video, the Dwemer too can trace their origins to the ancient elven kingdom of Altmora? Let me lay out the whole Altmora matter so we can go deeper on this theory. From the Varieties of Faith book, the Auriel section. Auriel, king of the Aldmer. The elven Akatosh is Auriel. Auriel is the soul of Anoiel, who in turn is the soul of Anu the Everything. He is the chief of most Aldmeri pantheons. Most Altmeri and Bosmeri claim direct descent from Auriel. In his only known moment of weakness, he agreed to take part in the creation of the mortal plane, that act which forever sundered the elves from the spirit worlds of eternity. To make up for it, Auriel led the original Aldmer against the armies of Rourken in mythic times, vanquishing that tyrant and establishing the first kingdoms of the Altmer, Altmora, and Old Elnefey. He then ascended to heaven in full observance of his followers so that they might learn the steps needed to escape the mortal plane. More context comes from the book The Monomyth in the Altmeri Heart of the World section. Auriel could not save Altmora, the Elderwood, and it was lost to men. They were chased south and east to Old Elnefey, and Lorcan was close behind. He shattered that land into many. Finally, Trinimac, Auriel's greatest knight, knocked Lorcan down in front of his army and reached in with more than hands to take his heart. He was undone. The men dragged Lorcan's body away and swore blood vengeance on the heirs of Auriel for all time. To clarify, this is all taking place in the Dawn Era, during the turbulent times of creation, when the gods walked Nirn, and as is stated in both the Altmeri and Nordic traditions, they fought in a great war, when Lorcan's actions were discovered. Auriel was the king of the Aldmer who fought against Lorcan, known ashore by the Nords, and his armies of men. The Elven kingdom of Altmora was destroyed in this war, and the elves of that land fled south and east to Old Elnefey, which is alternatively known as Old Meris. Lorcan followed and wrought untold destruction, and so Old Elnefey is shattered, and what remains in the aftermath is Tamriel, Dawn's beauty. What I am suggesting is that the survivors of Altmora, whom Lorcan followed to Old Elnefey, were a group of elves that were the single common ancestor of both the Falmer and the Dwemer. If we take this literally, bearing in mind that this text is of a mythic nature, it would place the earliest Elven refugees from Altmora arriving somewhere in the northern reaches of what would become Tamriel. South and east from a frozen northern continent could plausibly mean Skyrim, Resdayn, or both. Groups of survivors could have landed separately or together before later splitting. Either way, it places these elves in the right geography. It would explain why the Altmer's divergent lineage does not or cannot reliably account for the presence of the Falmer or the Dwemer, unlike the Aelids, Kaima, or Dureni, whose departures from Somerset are well attested. This is speculation, but speculation grounded in the text. In this working theory, the assumption is that the survivors of Altmora may have looked somewhat like Gelebor perhaps, a paler, northern-looking elf that once inhabited Altmora far to the north. A type of elf that is both Proto-Falmer and Proto-Dwemer.
This is, or was, the epicenter of our religion. Most of the Snow Elf people worshipped Auriel.
We see in the Forgotten Vale, one of the last significant remnants of Falmer ruins, that Auriel certainly played a major role in their religion, which is consistent with other Elven races. If we follow on with this from the Altmora idea, Auriel tried and failed to save Altmora from Lorcan and his armies of men. Hence, Altmora became Atmora, a home to mankind, and this is where we have the impetus for a potential divide among these Elven survivors. Imagine the survivors of Altmora huddled in the frozen north of what would become Tamriel. Their homeland is gone, the armies of Lorcan drove them from everything they knew, and in that moment of despair, a schism forms. Some say, Auriel will save us. He led us before. He will lead us again. We must keep the faith. But others look at their dead, at their shattered kingdoms, at the god who promised them protection and failed to deliver, and they say, no, never again. You can imagine this Elven group splitting ideologically based on how they responded to the loss of their kingdom. With this idea, there would be a group that would develop into the Falmer, those who remained steadfast in their faith in Auriel and the other gods despite the loss of their home, and on the other hand, you would have the group that would later develop into the Dwemer, those who became faithless after the gods, chiefly Auriel, had failed to protect them from Lorcan and his armies. They could have decried the gods and faith in them as foolish. Look how that faith had been rewarded. Perhaps when tensions grew too great, the group divided, the Proto-Dwemer going east across the Velothi Mountains, becoming reclusive, turning inward, relying on their own ingenuity and engineering to solve their problems, because clearly the gods could not save them. Or perhaps it was the Proto-Falmer who left Resdayn for Skyrim, unable to abide the Dwemer's profane ways. I think this theory places both the Falmer and the Dwemer in the correct places geographically, and also provides the impetus for the Dwemer to become a faithless society, fostering their hubris, relying on, as Vivec poetically says, their gods of reason and logic. Even symbolically, you have the Falmer worshipping Auriel and the gods, looking to the heavens, to the sun, to the divine, and then you have the Dwemer building underground, in the dark, mining, engineering, looking to the material world for salvation. Thematically, I think this fits very well. It would explain why they first diverged so heavily from other elven societies and why they advanced so much, having turned to self-reliance rather than ritual and gods. In essence, the gods failed them, they were either too weak or merely indifferent, and so they abandoned their faith and instead turned to their own ingenuity to solve their problems. To neatly summarize this theory once more, Auriel failed to save Altmora from Rourken and his armies of men. The survivors fled south and east, ending up in what is modern-day Skyrim. The survivors who held to their faith in Auriel and the gods remained in Skyrim and developed into the Falmer. Those who felt the gods had failed them, separated from those blinded by faith, went east and founded Dwemer, which would later be known as Resdayn, and then modern-day Morrowind. Hundreds of permutations could apply to the specifics of their arrival and split, but broadly, I find the idea that the Falmer and Dwemer descended from the elven survivors of the fall of Altmora very compelling. If this theory is correct, then it makes the future of these elven races and their interactions far juicier. If we fast forward the timeline to the late Merethic era, we would have the Dwemer and their underground kingdoms already established in Skyrim, though perhaps not at peak population yet, with the Snow Elves above getting wiped out by the Nords of Altmora. With the Altmora theory in mind, the Dwemer would feel so vindicated as the desperate Snow Elves who had placed their faith in the gods are failed once more and come pleading for help. Kalselmo's stone, found in the ruins of Nuchuand Zel, now known as Markarth, is vitally important for our understanding of the Falmer language. It is similar to the real-world Rosetta Stone, containing the same passage rendered in different languages side by side. We have both the Dwemer and Falmer writing that translates to the same declaration, written as a kind of monument to the two races' agreement. Firstly, I want to remark that the Dwemer and Falmer alphabets are very similar to each other. The former more prosaic and the latter with more ornate flourishes, but the fundamental similarities are easy to see. This perhaps could be further evidence of a closely shared ancestry, though we must also consider that Ayleid and Ultima Text shares similarly styled lettering. Perhaps such is the case with all elven societies, harkening back to an origin when old Elnafey was whole and Auriel was king in a physical sense. Regardless, the text of Kalselmo's stone has a translation provided by Kurt Kuhlmann, the co-lead designer on Skyrim. And so it was that your people were given passage to our steam gardens and the protections of our power. Literally, protection of our mathematics. Many of your people had perished under the roaring, snow-throated kings of Mora, and your wills were broken, and we heard you, and sent our machines against your enemies to thereby take you under. Only by the grace of the Dwemer did your culture survive, and only by the 15 and 1 tones did your new lives begin. We do not desire thanks, for we do not believe in it. We do not ask for gratitude, for we do not believe in it. We only request you partake of the symbol of our bond, the fruit of the stones around us. And as your vision clouds, as the darkness sets in, fear not. Know only our mercy and the radiance of our affection, which unbinds your bones to the earth before, and sets your final path to the music of your new eternity. In the context of the Altmora theory, this whole passage reads with a new level of arrogance. The Dwemer were right, in this case, to turn away from the gods and instead rely on their own ingenuity. Their mathematics and engineering provided salvation to their cousins, who once would have chided their decision to turn away from the gods. I discussed this passage extensively in the Falmer video, which I recommend watching after this one if you have not. But it's worth noting that the Dwemer did not have to help the Falmer. There is a kind of benevolence displayed here, or at least feigned, even if from a self-satisfied, I was right position. Then again, we cannot forget that the Falmer eventually become their slaves. Before we examine the next theory, we must speak of something that may seem tangential but will illuminate everything that follows. We must speak of Kalpas.
Some would say that all things must end, so that the next can come to pass. Perhaps this world is simply the egg of the next Kalpa? Lean Vokin? Would you stop the next world from being born?
Firstly, I need to make clear that there are 3 mentions of the term Kalpa across the Elder Scrolls games. You just heard one, and another is from the Song of Pelennor. And he listed his bloodline in the Aeliadun, and spoke of his father, a god of the previous Kalpa's world river. And from the 9 coruscations, King of Dreg fell to Mehrunes the Razor, was forced to the next Kalpa, to spiral ever out and see the land and sky preferred to see. Those are the extent of the textual or spoken lines mentioning Kalpa. However, several out-of-lore texts by ex-developers elaborate on the concept, and many mythologies, such as that of the Yakutans, Nords, and Khajiit, include the same core concept of the world's cyclical death and rebirth. So when we say Kalpa, we are referring to the underlying concept. It is not a statement declaring that all cultures explicitly use this terminology. So a Kalpa is understood to be the cosmic cycle itself, the grand rhythm of creation, the life, death, and rebirth that governs Mundus, the mortal realm. In simple terms, it is the full lifespan of a world in the Elder Scrolls universe, from its birth through all its ages and stories to its ultimate end, and then eventually its renewal. During a Kalpa, time flows linearly as we experience it. Past, present, and future, with the unique exception of the dragon breaks. But Kalpa's end, and the end of the world, as Paarthurnax alludes, is the egg of the next Kalpa. We are led to understand the ending of one world as the creation of the new. And with this implication, we can understand that the Dawn Era was not only the beginning of this world, but the ending of the previous one. The Dawn is a point of untime when contradictions abound. It is the entanglement of myth and stories, a time when the powerful spirits or beings who could survive the destruction persist, and once more the natural laws are established, and so does the timeline we know and love begin. Everything that happens in Tamrielic history unfolds within this cycle, as far as we know. The ending is interpreted differently by different cultures. To the Nords, it is Alduin fulfilling his grim purpose by devouring the world so the next may begin. To the Redguards, it is the coiling of Satakal, the Ouroboros consuming itself, a disaster to be escaped through the walkabout or by reaching the far shores. The Khajiit believe their souls are lifted by Kenarthi and flown to the sands behind the stars to play and pray until the next pounce. But what is also important to note is that most of these different mythologies point to a possibility of survival into the next world, and in some cases we get more explicit accounts, as is the case with Umaril's supposed father, or in the annotated Annuad, where the Elnefey, in this case referring to the ancestors of Men and Mer, and the Hist, are said to have survived the destruction of previous worlds. Of course, we don't have a complete understanding of all the specific functions of a Kalpa, but still, it seems to be a universally attested phenomenon across several different cultures. So we know about Kalpas, and that some myths suggest it is possible to survive between them. We know the Dwemer as an ingenious race, remarkably advanced, their technology exceeding the feats of all others. What if the Dwemer were survivors of a previous Kalpa? Perhaps this would explain their stature as an advanced civilization, especially so early on in history, and potentially this even solves their lack of a certain origin. No text states this directly, of course, but it would help explain their vastly advanced technology, including, mind you, temporal distorting technologies such as the Numidium, Ragnarthar, and the machine of Nechuthancast. If we entertain this idea seriously, then the Dwemer's defining traits begin to reveal a different perspective. Their obsession was never with gods as objects of worship, but with reality as a system, something measurable, manipulable, and ultimately solvable. This perhaps is not the mindset of a people merely reacting to the world they were born into. It could be that this is the mindset of a people who have seen a world end before. A culture that had witnessed a Kalpa's collapse would not mythologize the apocalypse. It would seek to outgrow it, to escape the limitations of the temporal entirely, and the works of the Dwemer could suggest precisely that. As the scholar Baladas Demnavani says, during the Dawn Era, they researched the death of the earth bones, what we now call the laws of nature, dissecting the process of the sacred willing itself into the profane. I believe their mechanists and tonal architects discovered systematic regression techniques to perform the reverse, that is, to create the sacred from the deaths of the profane. Artifacts in Dwemer ruins show almost no signs of decay, suggesting they found ways to deny or control the earth bones governing time and decay. Think of the grand ocularies and the orreries, or other examples of Dwemer engineering that still function to this day. Perhaps they were not defying the gods out of mere arrogance, they were learning to operate outside the system because they knew the system itself was temporary. One could argue that their ambitions with tonal architecture and ultimately the creation of the Numidium feel less like attempts at godhood in the conventional sense and more like attempts to alter or escape the rules of existence altogether. Survival through abstraction, a plan to supersede reality, to step outside the Kalpic cycles. Remember, this is a theory, a pretty wild one at that, but it's one that lines up with their unaccounted for early origins and one that would shape their pursuit of technology that can alter reality itself. Consider that whenever the Numidium walks, it brings about a dragon break, a collapse of linear time, a brief return to the chaotic conditions of the dawn. Whether this was an unintended consequence of the Dwemer's true objective remains unknown, and we will return to the Numidium much later in the video, but for now, what is clear is the philosophical alignment, a people who refused worship, refused limitation, and may have ultimately refused the Kalpa itself. And if that is true, then the disappearance of the Dwemer was not an end, it was an answer. So we are left with three broad possibilities for the origins of the Dwemer. There are plenty of variations and other more intricate theories, but I feel as if these three cover the major possibilities. The first, descendants of Aldmeri explorers diverging over millennia in the dark places of Resdayn until they became something their Somerset cousins could not recognize. The second, survivors of the fall of Altmora, split from their Falmer cousins by a crisis of faith so profound it shaped their entire civilization for thousands of years. The third, that they are remnants of a previous Kalpa, carrying the memory of a world that already ended, already ancient when the Dawn Era began. Each theory has its problems, but as we continue this video, I implore you to keep each of them swirling in your mind, because as we learn more about the Dwemer, each provides new context for our next line of questioning. How did they see the world? What did they believe about the gods, mortality, reality itself? And why did their path diverge so violently from every other culture in Tamriel? Whether born of Aldmeri ambition, shattered continents, or the ashes of a previous Kalpa, the Dwemer were not ultimately defined by their beginnings, but by their refusal to accept the world as it was given to them. They heard the music underlying all reality and decided they could compose a better song. When we speak of the Dwemer, it is tempting to imagine them as a single people with a single purpose, a monolithic civilization marching in lockstep towards some grand design. Of course, there are several core identifiers, strongholds of industry stretching deep into the earth, gears turning, pipes bellowing steam, machines marching through halls made of a metal untarnished by time. But with a keen eye and a willingness to pay attention to the histories, we can see that the Dwemer were a politically fractured people. The Dwemer were not a grand unified empire, but a constellation of city-states, clans, and freehold colonies, each pursuing their own ambitions, even at the expense of their kin. They shared a language, a technological tradition, and a philosophical contempt for the gods, but they did not share a throne. To understand the Dwemer, we must first understand that there were, broadly speaking, three major centers of Dwemer civilization, three spheres of influence that developed along different trajectories, faced different enemies, and pursued different goals. Throughout the course of this video, we will discuss each in detail, but it would be wise to begin with the first and oldest sphere, Resdayn, the land we now call Morrowind. At first, this place was called Dwemereth, and it was the cradle of Dwemer civilization, or at least the earliest home, for which we have reliable records. Here in the shadow of Red Mountain, the great city-states flourished. Karaka, Nachulefdinth, Turenulal, these names echo through history as centers of learning, industry, and above all, ambition. And it was in Resdayn that the Dwemer discovered the heart of Lorkhan. It was here that Kagrenac forged his tools and dared to design divinity as one would a suit of armor. And it was here, at the Battle of Red Mountain, that an entire race vanished from the face of Nirn. The Battle of Red Mountain is the climax of a story centuries in the making, and one that must be properly understood before we dive into any deeper understanding of the enigma that are the Dwemer. It was the 3rd century of the First Era, year 222. King Vraga the Gifted assumed the throne in Skyrim and rapidly expanded what was called the First Empire of Nords. Within a span of 50 years, Skyrim ruled all of northern Tamriel, including most of present-day High Rock, a deep stretch of the Nibelheim Valley, and the whole of Morrowind. This period coincides with Nordic support for the Elysian slave rebellion in Cyrodiil, the earliest roots of the empire that we know today. And ultimately, it marks the turning point for mankind on Tamriel. The age of elven dominance was officially over. In Resdayn, the Dwemer and the Kalpa suffered under the yoke of the Nords. It is hard to find precise details about the conquest, but the 36 Lessons of Vivec does poetically describe several demon chieftains, powerful wielders of the Thumb, who were described as destroying Chimeri villages and Dwemeri strongholds, implying that the Nords were more than capable of dominating both peoples. It is important to understand, as is shown here, that the Dwemer were not some infallible, all-powerful super race that could beat anything and anyone they came into contact with. Consider that walking machines and industry might not necessarily prove superior to the use of magic and curses or the powerful shouts of the Nordic tongues that could shatter walls and summon storms. At the end of the day, the Dwemer felt it necessary to ally with the Kalpa, their ancient enemies, in order to resist Nordic oppression, and yet there is something about Dwemeri disposition that indicates this would not be the case if an alternative was available. But before I explain this unlikely alliance, I think it's best to give a brief primer on the Kalpa for those who are unfamiliar. The Elves of Somerset worshipped Auriel and the other Elven gods. In the Merethic era, the Daedric prince Boethia comes with revelation to an individual named Veloth. The prophet Veloth then begins preaching in hidden corners, bringing followers to the ways of the triangled truth, which in short is the worship of the three Daedra, Azura, Mephala, and Boethia. His followers are known as the Velothi, and they partake in an exodus from the Somerset Isles and eventually arrive in Resdayn. Here they are free to forge a society of their own, one based on the principles of fundamentalist ancestor worship and what they call the three good Daedra. These people come to be called the Kalpa, which translates to the Changed Ones. This establishes what is called High Velothi culture. If you explore Morrowind and find Daedric ruins like Balfell and ancient Velothi towers, such as the aforementioned Old Redania, these are hallmarks of this High Velothi culture. This is when the Dwemer and the Kalpa culture first came into contact with one another, and as the book Before the Ages of Man said, the Kalpa coveted the lands and resources of the Dwemer, and for centuries they provoked them with minor raids and territorial disputes. Vivec himself recalls the ancient enmity. Our brethren, the Dwemer, scorned the Daedra and mocked our foolish rituals, and preferred instead their gods of reason and logic. So the Kalpa and Dwemer were always at bitter war. The records of this period are scarce, but by the late Merethic era, this High Velothi culture had degenerated into tribes, not dissimilar to the Ashlanders we see of later eras. Some of these tribes would evolve and develop into the great houses of Morrowind that we know today, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. These Kalpa and Dwemer that resided in Resdayn were conquered around 1E 240, and Nordic occupation lasted for about 176 years, give or take, before any resistance could be successful. In year 1E 369, the High King Borgus, last of Isgramor's dynasty, is killed, and the long War of Succession breaks out. And when an occupying force is experiencing civil turmoil, the opportunity for liberation is far greater. This is where we see the Dwemer and the Kalpa put aside their differences and unite. That is perhaps a misleading description, because in reality, this alliance of two fundamentally opposed elven cultures hinged on the unlikely friendship of two remarkable individuals, Indoral Nerevar and Dumac, Dwarf King. Once the Nords were driven out, General Nerevar of the Kalpa and General Dumac of the Dwemer, who had come to love and respect one another, resolved to make peace between their peoples. In that time, I was but a junior counselor to Nerevar, and Nerevar's queen Almalexia and his other favourite counsellor, Sotha Sil, always doubted that such a peace might long survive, given the bitter disputes between Kalpa and Dwemer. But by negotiation and compromise, Nerevar and Dumac somehow managed to preserve a fragile peace. Almalexia, the wife of Nerevar, has additional insight. It was only when the Nords invaded Resdayn that the two nations were able to join as one, under the leadership of our Nerevar and the Dwarf King Dumac. In time, the two generals became blood friends, and on the day that Nerevar and I were wed, Dumac presented us with twin blades, Hopesfire and True Flame. Each was a magnificent blade, the pinnacle of Dwemer craftsmanship. Their blades burned with an unearthly fire, and the sight of them struck fear into our enemies. It is also worth noting that Nerevar's ring, moon and star, the very same that the Nerevarine wears to prove that they are in fact Nerevar reborn, was originally forged for him by the smiths of the Dwemer sorcerer priest Kagrenac and later blessed by Azura. The ring supposedly gave Nerevar supernatural powers of persuasion and indisputable proof of identity, since any other who tried to wear the ring would be killed instantly. We could conclude that this ring played a part in Nerevar's capacity to both unite the Chimer houses and convince all of them that an alliance with the Dwemer was feasible. We don't know the exact details of the timeline, but this knowledge makes me lean towards the idea that Dwemer and Nerevar became friends a span of time well before they would successfully drive out the Nords and form the First Council. Speaking of which, let us discuss this unprecedented alliance in more detail. Year 1E 416. The Nords are driven from Resdayn, and the First Council was formed, uniting the Dwemer and Chimer under a single governing body, headed by Dwemer Dwarf King and Lord Indoral Nerevar. For nearly 3 centuries, peace and prosperity reigned. From the text, Nerevar at Red Mountain. Then these two heroes worked long and hard to maintain that peace thereafter, though their counselors thought it could not last, or worse, that it shouldn't. Nerevar's queen and his generals, Almalexia, Sothasil, Vivec, told him to claim all Resdayn for his own, but Nerevar would not listen, for he remembered his friendship with Dwemer. There would be only peace. It is important to understand the full context here. This state of affairs seemingly hinged entirely on the friendship between two powerful individuals. There are numerous sources attesting to the doubts and protest from subordinates, but still the First Council held well for 284 years. We are talking the lifetimes of even a long-lived man thrice over. Yet when news came of what the Dwemer had done in secret, everything changed. Deep beneath Red Mountain, in those cavernous halls of ebony veins and belching lava flows, Dwemer miners had found something ancient, a great magical stone, something so powerful that the gods themselves hid it from the world at the dawn. By diverse methods, Lord Kagrenac, High Priest and Magecrafter of the ancient Dwemer, determined that this magical stone was the heart of the god Rourken, cast here in the Dawn Era as a punishment for his mischief in creating the mortal world. Determined to use its divine powers to create a new god for the exclusive benefits of the Dwemer, Kagrenac forged 3 great enchanted artifacts, which are called Kagrenac's Tools. Wraithguard is an enchanted gauntlet to protect its wearer from destruction when tapping the heart's power. Sunder is an enchanted hammer to strike the heart and produce the exact volume and quality of power desired. Keening is an enchanted blade that is used to flay and focus the power that rises from the heart. To any other race, the heart would have been viewed as either sacred or accursed, something never to be tampered with, but the Dwemer shed no such compunctions about transgressing the realms of the divine. This secret of the Dwemer, these schemes of Kagrenac, went unnoticed for a time, perhaps even unbeknownst to King Dwemer himself. But all would come to light. Vorin Dagoth would make it so. House Dagoth had discovered the source of the profane and secret power of the Dwemer, the legendary Heart of Rourken, which Dwemer's people had used to make themselves immortal and beyond the measure of the gods. In fact, one of their high priests, Kagrenac, was building a new god so that the Dwemer could claim Resdayn for their own. The tribunal urged Nerevar again to make war on the dwarves. Nerevar was troubled. He went to Dwemer, his friend of old, and asked if what Dagoth said was true. But Kagrenac and the high priests of the Dwemer had kept their new gods secret from their king, and Dwemer said the Dwemer were innocent of any wrongdoing. Nerevar was troubled again, and made pilgrimage to Holomaion, the sacred temple of Azura, who confirmed that all that Dagoth said was indeed true, and that the new god of the Dwemer should be destroyed for the safety of not only Resdayn, but for the whole world. When Nerevar went back and told his tribunal what the goddess had said, his queen and generals felt themselves proved aright, and again counselled him to war. There were reasons that the Dwemer and the Chimer had hated each other forever. Finally, Nerevar, angered that his friend Dwemer would lie to him, went back to Vvardenfell. This time, the Chimer King was arrayed in arms and armor and had his hosts around him, and he spoke harshly to Dwemer Dwarfork, King of Red Mountain. "You must give up your worship of the Heart of Rourken, or I shall forget our friendship and the deeds that were accomplished in its name." And Dwemer, who still knew nothing of Kagrenac's new god, but proud and protective as ever of his people, said, "We shall not relinquish that which has been our way for years beyond reckoning, just as the Chimer will not relinquish their ties to the lords and ladies of oblivion. And to come to my door in this way, arrayed in arms and armor and with your hosts around you, tells me you have already forgotten our friendship. "Stand down, my sweet Nerevar, or I swear by the 15-1 golden tones, I shall kill you and all your people." And so the Keimer and Dwemer went to war. There are several retellings of this conflict, but I tend to prefer this one because I think it presents the tragedy of Red Mountain so well. The love between Dumak and Nerevar is made clear. Their achievements were monumental, the course of history shaped by their friendship, an alliance held aloft only by their trust in one another, all despite the doubts of their closest council. They had brought near 3 centuries of prosperity for Resdayn, but it was the schemes of those around them, those who could not let go of old enmity, that would ultimately bring about the end. The details of the actual battle are various and contradictory. We have accounts of the Ashlanders, of the Tribunal Temple, of the Nordic songs, of Vivec himself, and other works of scholarship on the event. For a straightforward retelling, I tend to lean on the events as recounted by Vivec, the Tribunal, and the Ashlanders because they all broadly agree on the specifics of the war itself, but ultimately the final battle at Red Mountain culminated in the confrontation at the Heart Chamber, where both Dumak and Nerevar fought to the end. There, Nerevar the Keimer King met Dumak the Dwarf King, and they both collapsed from grievous wounds and draining magics. With Dumak fallen, and threatened by Dagoth and the others, Kagrenac turned his tools upon the heart, and Nerevar said he saw Kagrenac and all his Dwemer companions at once disappear from the world. In that instant, Dwemer everywhere disappeared without a trace. This is the moment of the Dwemer disappearance, total, complete, and instant. All Dwemer, everywhere, whether it be the proud Rourken of Völunnfell, the miners of Blackreach, or the warriors on the field of battle at Red Mountain. They all vanished. It remains the greatest mystery of their people. If we cannot say for certain how they vanished, we can still most certainly theorize, but in order to properly present and analyze each theory, we need to understand the fundamentals of the Dwemer, what makes their clock tick, so to say. The Dwemer are often called atheists, and some tend to take great issue with this because gods, magic, and the supernatural are endemic to the structure of the Elder Scrolls universe, but we must understand that this claim is a matter of perspective. One of the foremost Dwemer researchers, the long-lived Dunmer sorcerer Baladas Demnavani, says, "It was unfashionable among the Dwemer to view their spirits as synthetic constructs, 3, 4, or 40 creational gradients below the divine. During the Dawn Era, they researched the death of the Earthbones, what we call now the laws of nature, dissecting the process of the sacred willing itself into the profane. I believe their mechanists and tonal architects discovered systematic regression techniques to perform the reverse, that is, to create the sacred from the deaths of the profane." To break it down, the Dwemer did not deny the gods' existence. They knew them to be powerful beings, but they instead believed they were not worthy of worship. That what divided them from the so-called gods was not some divine order or necessary hierarchical condition, but rather for the Dwemer it was just an issue of power differential, a problem to be solved, something to be engineered, a disparity between divine and mortal that could be addressed with their reason and logic. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the Dwemer were anti-deity, or anti-theist. The term atheist perhaps lacks enough nuance, but in the sense that the Dwemer didn't worship any gods, it fits. It's ultimately a matter of perspective. Where the Keimer or other mortals would perceive what they called gods, the Dwemer merely see a concentration of power and will. There is a famous ancient tale of the Dwemer that illustrates this very well: Azura and the Box. Nechalbar had enjoyed an adventurous youth and had grown to be a very wise, very old Dwemer who spent his life searching for the truth and dispelling superstitions. He invented much and created many theorems and logic structures that bore his name. But much of the world still puzzled him, and nothing was a greater enigma to him than the nature of the Aedra and Daedra. Over the course of his research, he came to the conclusion that many of the gods were entirely fabricated by man and Mer. Nothing, however, was a greater question to Nechalbar than the limits of divine power. Were the greater beings the masters of the entire world, or did the humbler creatures have the strength to forge their own destinies? As Nechalbar found himself nearing the end of his life, he felt he must understand this last basic truth. So Nechalbar convinced a Keimer priest named Aetherium to summon Azura so that he could test her. Presumably this is happening during the peacetime of the First Council. Aetherium summoned Azura. After the usual rituals by which the priest declared his faith in her powers, and Azura agreed to do no harm to him, Nechalbar and a dozen of his students entered the summoning chamber, carrying with them a large box. As we see you in our land, Azura, you are the goddess of dusk and dawn, and all the mysteries therein, said Nechalbar, trying to appear as kindly and obsequious as he could be. It is said that your knowledge is absolute. So it is, smiled the Daedra. You would know, for example, what is in this wooden box, said Nechalbar. Azura turned to Aetherium, her brow furrowed. The priest was quick to explain. Goddess, this Dwemer is a very wise and respected man. Believe me, please. The intention is not to mock your greatness, but to demonstrate it to this scientist and to the rest of his skeptical race. I have tried to explain your power to him, but his philosophy is such that he must see it demonstrated. If I am to demonstrate my might in a way to bring the Dwemer race to understanding, it might have been a more impressive feat you would have me do, growled Azura, and turned to look Nechalbar in the eyes. There is a red-petaled flower in the box. Nechalbar did not smile or frown. He simply opened the box and revealed to all that it was empty. When the students turned to look to Azura, she was gone. Only Aetherium had seen the goddess's expression before she vanished, and he could not speak. He was trembling so. A curse had fallen, he knew that truly, but even crueler was the knowledge of divine power that had been demonstrated. Nechalbar also looked pale, uncertain on his feet, but his face shone with not fear, but bliss, the smile of a Dwemer finding evidence for a truth only suspected. The truth he suspected? That the gods did not have absolute knowledge as they claimed. 2 of his students supported him, and 2 more supported the priest as they left the chamber. I have studied very much over the years, performed countless experiments, taught myself 1,000 languages, and yet the skill that has taught me the final truth is one that I learned when I was but a poor, young man, trying only to have enough gold to eat, whispered the sage. As he was escorted up the stairs to his bed, a red flower petal fell from the sleeve of his voluminous robe. Nechalbar died that night, a portrait of peace that comes from contented knowledge. Nechalbar had used sleight of hand to try and prove the limits of Azura. If her knowledge was absolute as she claimed, it would have been impossible to fool her. Even if she was right for a moment that the red flower was in the box, she proclaimed absolute knowledge yet could not foresee the sleight of hand. Azura was furious at this embarrassment, and she got her quick revenge on Nechalbar, but as the story says, he died a portrait of peace, contented with the knowledge that the gods were not absolute. They were not omniscient and therefore fallible, which means they could be tricked and perhaps surmounted. A petty trick of sleight of hand had taught him the final truth he searched for. This book illustrates the Dwemer mindset quite well, but there are reasons to doubt the details. You see, this series of ancient tales of the Dwemer were written by Marabar Sul, the most likely pseudonym of Gorfelem, a prolific writer of penny dreadful romances during the interregnum period. Hasfat Antabalus, in his essay on Marabar Sul and the trivialization of the Dwemer in popular culture, includes this critique and says that the ancient tales of the Dwemer was definitively debunked in scholarly circles as early as the reign of Kataraya I. In light of this, the publishers note that is at the end of the Azura in the Box tale addresses this fact. This is another tale whose origin is unmistakably Dwemer. Again, the words of some Aldmeri's translations are quite different, but the essence of the story is the same. The Dunmer have a similar tale about Nechalbar, but in the Dunmer version, Azura recognizes the trick and refuses to answer the question. She slays the Dwemer present for their skepticism and curses the Dunmer for blasphemy. In the Aldmeri versions, Azura is tricked not by an empty box, but by a box containing a sphere which somehow becomes a flat square. Of course, the Aldmeri versions, being a few steps closer to the original Dwemer, are much more difficult to understand. Perhaps this stage magic explanation was added by Gorfelem because of Felem's own experience with such tricks in his plays when a mage was not available. So the tale's origins are certainly Dwemer, but the actual writing we have read is filtered through the words of a playwright trying to make the tale digestible for contemporary audiences. Regardless, the root of the Dwemer tale includes a sage triumphing over Azura in some way, proving holes in her claims of omniscience, and this stands in stark contrast to the Dunmer version of the tale, in which Azura, with absolute knowledge, recognizes the petty trick and smites the Dwemer present. Of course, it will be impossible to tell which was the truth, truth from the texts alone, but we can infer from in-game experiences, and of course other tales, that these Daedric princes are not infallible, and often their desires are thwarted by heroes or other gods. But the outsized importance of this tale is that it neatly illustrates the core of the Dwemer belief and their rejection of the gods as divine, untouchable, unsurmountable forces. You may find it interesting that the Psijic Order, the sages of Artaeum, who split from the Altmora of Somerset when they began abandoning their ancient systems in favour of elite worship, share a similar understanding of the gods to the Dwemer. Yet it is their response to this knowledge that differs. The Psijics preserve the original beliefs of the Aldmer, the old ways, as they are named. Kellerus, the Lawmaster, explains, "What, after all, is the origin of these spiritual forces that move the invisible strings of Mundus? Any neophyte of Artaeum knows that these spirits are our ancestors, and that while living, they too were bewildered by the spirits of their ancestors, and so on back to the original Akarjai. The Daedra and gods to whom the common people turn are no more than the spirits of superior men and women whose power and passion granted them great influence in the afterworld." This aligns well with what Baladas Demnavani tells us about the Dwemer. It was unfashionable among the Dwemer to view their spirits as synthetic constructs, 3, 4, or 40 creational gradients below the divine. Both the Dwemer and the Psijics did not view the gods, the divine, as this rigid hierarchical structure that was fixed and eternal. The Psijics, recognizing that mortals could become gods, devoted themselves to wisdom and patience. They aspire to harmony with the universe and to become the hidden hand that guides the world to goodness. As the sage Teherete says in The Old Ways, "In Mundus, conflict and disparity are what bring change, and change is the most sacred of the 11 forces. Change is the force without focus or origin. It is the duty of the disciplined Psijic to dilute change where it brings greed, gluttony, sloth, ignorance, prejudice, cruelty, and to encourage change where it brings excellence, beauty, happiness, and enlightenment. As such, the faithful counsel has but one master, his mind. If the man the Psijic counsels acts wickedly and brings Ogenthir, bad change, and will otherwise not be counselled, it is the Psijic's duty to counterbalance the Ogenthir by any means necessary." While the Psijics, with this knowledge of the universe, take on the role of caretakers, ushering a better world for all, the Dwemer took away something else entirely. Driven by their hubris, the Dwemer sought to overcome the universe, to transcend the binds of reality, to dispel with the illusory, and to design their way to divinity. There is no greater example of this philosophy in action than their endeavours with tonal architecture. First, let's get all on the same page about what exactly this is. There are certain interpretations of Mundus as a song, that the fundamentals beneath reality are in fact harmonics and vibration. There are several powers across several diverse cultures that support such an idea. One you are most likely to be incredibly familiar with is the Thum, or dragon shouts as they are called in common parlance. When dragons or individuals use the Thum, they are in a way speaking reality into existence. It is not magic in the traditional sense, whereby spells are harnessed with magicka that leaks into Mundus through the sun and stars. Rather, it is a power that is a kind of expressed will that interacts with reality itself, like writing new notes into the song. If you look at other examples, such as the Yakuran sword singing or the Akaviri Kiai, each description alludes to some kind of sound-based function, and the same applies to tonal architecture. The tonal architects of the Dwemer are attested in many sources, and it is their methods or designs that are held responsible for the many unbelievably brilliant technologies of their kind. But as is common in the sentiments of the Dwemer, this interaction with the tones of existence, with the shaping of reality, was not done via meditation or spiritual enlightenment, such is the case with the Thum or sword singing, but rather it is done with engineering and science. We actually have recovered examples of the tools used by the Dwemer in their tonal projects. The talk of tonal constancy is a dwarven craft designed to amplify and maybe even help shape the user's voice, and the tonal attenuator was a device that these tonal architects would use to protect their ears and thought organs, their brains, against harmonic feedback fluctuations. We also have examples of dwarven tonal forks and resonators, devices used for tuning and amplification. The specifics of these technologies are not fully understood, but all point to a manipulation of tones in order to create their ingenious technologies and advancements. The scholar Voronara Cleave, in her book A Guide to Dwemer Megastructures, says, At the height of their power, the Dwemer exhibited near total mastery of tonal forces. Even now, countless centuries later, they remain peerless in this respect. Sound, not magic, facilitated their rise to power. I am continually astounded by tonal forces' wide range of uses. The Dwemer used sound in mining, medicine, architecture, even psychology. It is the latter use that I find most intriguing. According to ancient Chimeri scholarship, the Dwemer could employ tonal forces to bend weaker minds to their will, a form of complex oral hypnosis. Luckily, the dwarves never managed to mobilize this technology on the battlefield against our august ancestors. The scale and complexity of the devices likely made transportation near impossible, but they still managed to employ it on a limited scale using massive devices called tonal resonators. If the legends are true, these resonators were incredibly complex architectural wonders. They stood taller than the most imposing giants and filled cavernous chambers with pipes, dials, and pistons. When enabled, the resonators released a series of powerful tones that could alter the brainwaves of lesser mer and men, inducing deep calm and profound pleasure, or even paranoia and terror. The uses for such a device are virtually limitless. Tonal architecture, that is, their ability to manipulate the underlying harmonics of existence for their benefit, is a core reason for their most miraculous technologies. It could explain the everlasting structures and machinery. One of the foremost dwarven scholars, Kalpa, notes, "No other race has replicated whatever process was used to create dwarven metal, although it can be easily mistaken for bronze, and in fact many forgers of dwarven materials use bronze to create their fake replicas. It is most definitely a distinct type of metal of its own. I have personally seen metallurgists attempt to combine several different types of steel and common and rare ores in order to imitate dwarven metal's exclusive properties, but the only method that has been successful is to melt down existing dwarven metallic scraps and start over from there." It is not an intense logical leap to suggest that tonal architecture may have played a part in this metal's remarkable qualities, particularly its resistance to the usually unforgiving tides of time. Perhaps we could speculate that the very material with which they forged brilliant machines and creations was itself an alloy made with the necessary manipulation of tonal forces, potentially explaining why their ancient machinery still persists and functions in such remarkable condition, considering that it has been without manual maintenance for well over 3,000 years. Balladas says something interesting when asked about Dwemer language. Some Dwemer books, especially records dating from after the founding of Resdayn, were written in Aldmeri, making them accessible to modern scholars. However, even in Aldmeri, many Dwemer terms remain uncertain. As the books and other artifacts in Dwemer ruins rarely show signs of wear or age, I believe that the Dwemer knew of a preservative effect, perhaps a device still active which denies or controls the earth bones, governing time and decay. Assuming tonal architecture is in some way responsible for every marvelous creation of the Dwemer could be a pitfall, a lazy explanation perhaps. However, I do just want to emphasize how important and ubiquitous tonal architects appeared to be in Dwemer society. For starters, Kagrenac, the chief tonal architect, was even at times called a high priest, and we also have examples of Dumak dwarf kings swearing by the 15-in-1 tones, and this also comes up in the writings of Kalselmo Stone. Perhaps you could imagine an analogy of a society so devoted to the pursuit of logic and science that they would swear by the laws of physics, and cults of personality develop around the greatest scientists and pioneers. The book Dwemer Inquiries Volume 2 supports such a notion. The limited written record supports the perception of the Deep Elves as culturally revering the pursuits of logic and science. This stands in stark contrast to the belief system of most other Mer cultures. When we imagine a society structured around such a central ideology, it seems reasonable that prolific scholars, especially in fields such as mathematics, metallurgy, or architecture, would be elevated to social status like that of clergy in a more mystically inclined culture. Considering how ubiquitous tonal architecture seems to be applied to many different fields and crafts, I don't think it is a weak assumption that the unexplainable gaps of Dwemer tech can be filled with the idea they manipulated tonal forces to change the rules of reality in a localized sense. As we progress through this exploration of the Dwemer, keep these insights swirling in the back of your mind, because they will color your interpretation of all to come. For example, I feel as if it is reasonable to speculate that tonal architecture played some role in the creation of the animunculi, the autonomous machines that patrol and carry out their designer's will thousands of years after their disappearance. In their denial of both phenomena and noumena, the Dwemer found comfort in the creation of animunculi, which in their operation combined two incompatible principles, thus denying both. The animunculi, otherwise called automatons, are perhaps the most recognizable Dwemer creation. No other race or society could conjure up such constructions. A design for every use case, mining, guarding, maintenance, and warfare, there appeared few limitations to the scope of Dwemer creativity. Calcelmo of Markarth, foremost among living Dwemer scholars, describes them in his treatise Dwarves, Volume 2. Dwarves created and manufactured on a very broad scale thousands of mechanical apparatuses of varying complexity, the most simple of which is the standard arachnid design used to ward off trespassers. We are so far uncertain as to how the dwarves were able to bring to life these remarkably intelligent machines. Simple, he calls them, but simplicity is deceptive. The dwarven spider is versatile beyond its appearance. Some scuttle through ruins repairing damaged systems, some burst from pressure vaults, some emit electrical barriers, charging themselves with crackling blue energy before discharging lethal shocks. In Morrowind, models appear quite different, bulbous bodies capable of emitting poisonous gas mounted on 6 metal legs. What material comprises that swelling up a body remains unclear. It warps and expands in ways metal should not. And these simple machines display a cunning that belies their size. Calcelmo himself witnessed one stalk a highly trained thief for several hours, waiting patiently until the man was occupied with a lock before ambushing him. The sphere is more sophisticated still. When idle, it patrols corridors in a compact ball. The moment it detects an intruder, it unfolds into a mechanical warrior, blade extended, crossbow primed, with a speed that is startling. The Centurion is the pinnacle of standard Dwemer war engineering. Heavily armored constructs with hammers or maces on one arm, spring-loaded blades on the other, capable of venting jets of scalding steam. Most stand dormant within charging gantries until disturbed, awakened only by trespassers. And there are stranger things still. Dwarven colossi, beings of such scale they dwarf even centurions, armed with rotary blade gauntlets and cannons. There are the dynasters, great carriers constructed in resemblance of horned behemoth shulks. Dwarven ballistae, autonomous and mobile ranged weaponry, and there are delvers, great engines used for subterranean excavation, complex machines with lasers and drills used to clear room for the Dwemer's vast underground strongholds. It is worth noting that there seems to be regional variations and one major discrepancy between the automatons of Resdayn, Morrowind, and the automatons found in Skyrim and beyond, and it is this discrepancy that may lead us to a better understanding of the underlying technology. For what it's worth, the Dwemer automatons of Morrowind and those of Skyrim have quite different appearances. The former would slot well into some 1980s dark fantasy film, and the latter have a more ornate and intricate appearance. Now, this difference is largely explained simply in a way which is not entirely satisfying for the internal logic of the Elder Scrolls, but this is likely simply a creative choice in art direction between the games. Consider that the animunculi found on Vvardenfell in the ESO Morrowind expansions appear most similar to Skyrim's automatons, which seem to represent the most modern incarnation of the Dwemer look. However, I do just want to point out the architectural differences between Resdayn Dwemer and the Dwemer of Skyrim are shown clearly, so that's cool. But with the aesthetics addressed, let's look more deeply at the textual sources about automatons and how they function, because we will find some interesting differences. Of course, we can first establish that these machines harness the power of steam for their function. That much is clear. And in terms of engineering, we can find gyros, likely for balance, and dwarven oil, possibly involved in power, but given it would be a limited supply, I imagine it would be used to maintain joint lubrication. We also have sources speak of internal boilers, which, explains the steam. The intricacies of the movement aren't that unfathomable, but rather it is the apparent sentience or executive function. These are adaptable machines that can take in the context of their environment and make strategic decisions. The real mystery is what makes that work? In Morrowind, the automatons you find lack the soul gems found in the Dwemer machines of Skyrim. An excavation report by Seniulius Cadiusus speaks of something that offers a vital clue about the automaton operation. I also heard a strange story about the Centurion spider that we captured and sent back to Cyrodiil. The ship captain I hired wrote to me with an odd story. He said that the spider nearly broke through its cage several times while near Vvardenfell, but once he left the Sea of Ghosts, the Centurion suddenly stopped working. What happened next shows that he had more wits than I gave him credit for. He ordered the ship turned about, and as they approached Vvardenfell again, the Centurion began moving just as suddenly. This is a curious phenomenon, and certainly deserves more investigation. Clearly, this phenomenon has something to do with proximity to Vvardenfell. Now, there are two main possibilities I would consider here. The Dwemer animunculi have a sentience or operative function that is dependent on a signal. Leave the range and it ceases function. Re-enter range and it operates again. But the question is, what is the signal sourced from? Obviously, it cannot be done from the Dwemer themselves because they have long disappeared and the automatons still function. One possibility is that there is some kind of signal function from within the Dwemer strongholds, perhaps emanating from their uniquely styled towers. The other possibility is that the signal of resonance is from the heart of Lorkhan itself, which of course is deep within Red Mountain on Vvardenfell Island, and this would explain why they suddenly cease function after leaving the Sea of Ghosts. Now this differs in function to the automatons of Skyrim and beyond in a major way. Simply put, other automatons are well out of range of Vvardenfell. We have previously speculated that the Dwemer of expanded regions had to adapt to their technology and use soul gems in place of a resonance with the heart of Lorkhan, if that is the case. Soul gems are found on the Dwemer animunculi that you encounter in Skyrim, and there are many sources that theorize soul gems play a part in their power or function. But I do need to make one important clarification here. The automatons in the Elder Scrolls Online do not drop soul gems, however, this is likely a result of gameplay looting decisions, not a reflection of the lore. I say this because even texts and dialogue within ESO itself make the same speculations about soul gems involved in their power and describes them as part of Dwemer machinery.
For example, the Vanos siblings are two Dwemer researchers who seem relatively certain about the use of soul gems. Kirith Vanos says, "I see two important bits of lore. One explains how Dwemer used soul gems to power their constructs." And Raynor Vanos, a researcher who specializes in Dwemer machinery, a self-described genius who created his own spider control rod, writes in his travel diary,
"The Dwemer seem to use soul gems to power their constructs. Where did they get all the souls for it? Bears further research. Might be able to use them to power more mundane things. Magical house cleaning for everyone? Why not? Maybe all the souls were gathered from their Falmer slaves. I won't go into that here because I elaborate in the Falmer video we made, but further ESO-based evidence includes the description of the whirring dwarven dynamo. The heart of any dwarven device is the dynamo, a combination reactor and distributor for its soul gem power source. There is also Bedani the Artificer, another researcher who in ESO says, "It's not every day I get a chance to dissect a dwarven resonator, powered by minor soul gems, you know." And another example, we have Razak's Opus pet description, a loyal steam-powered dwarven spider fueled by magicka from a soul gem that will last for eras. It is clear that ESO, despite the lack of soul gems lootable from automatons, is communicating the idea that they do in fact include soul gems in their design, and this perhaps would also apply to the Dwemer constructs of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. We have to remember that the Elder Scrolls develop and recontextualize lore over time, and so perhaps in retrospect the Vvardenfell Dwemer automatons also used soul gems in their design. Don't get me wrong, I love the idea that they are some kind of resonance from the heart of Lorkhan and therefore cease working when they leave proximity. And I like the idea that soul gems act as a sort of innovation to get around this problem when expanding to distant regions such as Skyrim and Hammerfell, but regardless, in this case, I do think it's important to carefully consider lore implications in contrast to gameplay considerations. So, soul gems play a vital part in the function of animunculi. Sula Trebatius's research notes offer some additional insights. It is just as Calcelmo described in Dwarves Volume 2. Their appearance does, in fact, resemble that of an arachnid. I had thought that to be an embellishment given by his source. The inclusion of the soul gem into the design of the apparatus is quite remarkable. It could explain the focus for the lightning that he describes. Oddly enough, it doesn't appear to be the main power source for the apparatus.
Perhaps some sort of harmonic resonance with the energies contained in the soul gem to bring heat to a small boiler.
Too early to say conclusively. That does raise the question of where they get the liquid for the boiler, however. There are many questions remaining, but I think it is safe to say with confidence that soul gems provide a vital component of automaton function. Raynor Vanos, when talking about the Clockwork Apostle Proctor Luciana Pullo and her prosthetic arms, explains, "She was severely injured, but he restored her using supplemental clockwork body parts. Soul gems power the parts, as with any other enchanted item. She received so many replacements, she's functionally immortal." While the clockwork prosthetics are not of Dwemer design, they are iterations of the same underlying tech made by Sotha Sil, and so the idea that soul gems power the parts further supports the idea that the soul gems themselves are the power source for automatons.
Consider also in Skyrim, the size of the soul gem used seems to correspond with the size of the construct. With grand soul gems found in the Dwarven Centurions, and with smaller automatons, you will find soul gems of smaller size, like lesser and petty. This perhaps supports the idea that the soul gem is in fact related to the power mechanism. If so, we are still left with the question, how are they programmed? What drives them? It could be a secondary function of a soul gem, or it could be tonal architecture, some kind of imprinted instruction set perhaps, trained on mortal minds. Remember the Dwemer resonators we discussed earlier, said to be able to exert mind control through tones? Perhaps such similar tonal controls are used to exert the thinking function over the machines. Maybe there is only a certain range which these can extend, explaining why that automaton ceased to function when it left the Sea of Ghosts. It simply left the range of the resonator. They are remarkable machines, and yet what we are commonly exposed to does not represent the pinnacle of automaton innovation. I do not yet speak of the Numidium, but a smaller complexity, one that rivals the forms of a mortal. I am speaking of the Dwarven Architons, humanoid automatons that functionally work as you would expect a Dwemer soldier to. They wield an array of weaponry, and some have arms retrofitted to a specialized purpose, such as a crossbow or a flame cannon, and curiously their forms are embedded with what appear to be small pieces of Aetherium, similar to the armor of the Arkthzand Armory style. You may remember Aetherium from the quest Lost to the Ages in Skyrim. Perhaps you remember reading the book The Aetherium Wars. I get ahead of myself. Before we start getting into the specifics of that war, we should first ground ourselves in the second sphere of Dwemer civilization, the Dwemer of Skyrim. Amongst the frigid peaks and cool valleys of mighty Skyrim, the Dwemer have long dwelt. As we discussed during the origin theories, the Dwemer of Skyrim must have predated Nordic arrival in order to provide refuge to the Falmer.
We had always maintained an uneasy alliance with the underground-dwelling dwarves, and when faced with extinction, we turned to them for help.
Which means that the Dwemer have been in Skyrim since at least the late Merethic era, and possibly, despite the typical rendition of Dwemeri migration, the Dwemer could have been in Skyrim before Resdayn, especially if we were to consider the Altmora theory, or perhaps the Kalpa theory. I know this flies in the face of conventional understanding, but we don't even really know for sure how the Dwemer got into Resdayn in the first place. But the same goes for Skyrim. This is merely a possibility to indulge, but at the same time, there isn't really a strong reason to doubt the migration from Resdayn concept. According to the previously discussed fallible text before the Ages of Man, in the late Middle Merethic era, the Dwemer, dwarves, free-thinking, reclusive elven clans devoted to the secrets of science, engineering, and alchemy established underground cities and communities in the mountain range, later the Velothi Mountains, separating modern Skyrim and Morrowind. It is perfectly feasible that the Dwemer began in Vvardenfell, and then in this latter part of the Middle Merethic era they began migrating to the Velothi Mountains, and then by the late Merethic they had expanded into Skyrim proper. Thelway Gelain gives excellent insight into the divergent cultures in her book Dwemer Inquiries Volume 1. The migration of the Deep Elves from their ancestral Dwemereth, now Morrowind, is a generally accepted fact. Recorded history supports this, specifically mentioning the Rourken clan's refusal to join King Dumac in the forming of the First Council and their subsequent exodus to Hammerfell. The architectural premise is also sound, as the building habits of the dwarves adapted and changed, albeit slowly and in subtle ways, over time and land. I propose that some of these differences are stylistic as well as practical. Traditional viewpoints suggest that the Vvardenfell Dwemer were the most prolific of their kind. Based on my excavations throughout Skyrim, Morrowind, and High Rock, I am not sure that this is the case. While Vvardenfell is almost cluttered with dwarven ruins poking through the surface of the landscape, the construction of those ruins is fundamentally different from the majority of what I've observed elsewhere. Furthermore, as we delve into Vvardenfell ruins, we notice that their internal structure is quite different. While major civic and operational chambers are found near the surface in a Vvardenfell ruin, that is not typically the case on the mainland. Minor passageways and storehouse rooms are near the surface, but more important locations do not occur until we explore much deeper. Because such major locations are well hidden in Dwemer ruins outside of Morrowind, many scholars believed they were in fact not present in ruins outside that province. This premature conclusion has led some to believe such sites to be mere outposts. My research has shown this not to be the case. There are a few theories that may explain this difference. Perhaps clan architects simply had their own styles and preferences when it came to civic planning. This seems only somewhat likely, as Dwarven techniques were based on empirical study, and there was likely little room for creative interpretation when it came to building technique. Geological makeup of the terrain almost certainly played a role, especially in a region like northern Skyrim, where the ground near the surface is very rocky and often frozen, as opposed to the volcanic substratum common in Vvardenfell or the ubiquitous aquifers found in Hammerfell. It is possible that Dwarven architects in the north were not able to excavate larger structures until reaching more pliable strata. Thelway does a brilliant job explaining the differences between the Dwemer of Resdayn and Skyrim, and she is certainly correct about the Dwemer of Skyrim. These were not mere outposts and stockpiles, but as we know, the depths of Blackreach reveal an entirely different world that most people above ground don't even know exists. One earmark of what I believe was the prevalent Dwemer style among northern clans was a feature I call the deep venue. Deep venues are often characterized as being made up of one or more expansive natural caverns in which several other structures will occur. Structures within the venue may be carved from the stone itself or freely erected upon the cavern floor. The largest and most impressive venues, such as those found in Bethardams, may even feature roads wide enough for 10 large men to walk shoulder meets shoulder along it. My studies and this text have focused heavily on the fact that the Dwemer archaeological sites west of Vvardenfell seem to be built at much greater depths than their counterparts near Red Mountain. I believe there was a specific threshold to which Dwarven excavators would dig before the construction of vital structures would begin. I have referred to this threshold as the geocline, but I have found that to often be redundant with the deep venue of a colony. Still, there is some variation in the actual depth of a deep venue, whereas the geocline is always the marker where I reason the city proper begins. Tunnels and chambers at more shallow depths, while often grand in their architectural style, appear to have served little in the way of critical civic purpose. Above the geocline, surplus stores of food, warehouse chambers that may have been used in trading with nearby surface settlements, and barracks for topside patrols are common. These tunnels, I have observed, can meander in a seemingly more random pattern than those planned structures beneath. I hypothesize that this may be due to the unpredictable nature of any excavation, even to a race as clever as the Dwemer. Surely unexpected deposits of stone or geological events could make the effort difficult, and I think that these haphazard tunnels are often the result of the search for suitable substratum to build within. I have found in a small number of ruins reference to a geological anomaly or place known as Falzardum Din. This is intriguing because the term not only appears in a few tablet fragments, but also very specifically on ornate metal frames in the deepest reaches of the Alftand, Arkthzand, and Mzincha strongholds of Skyrim. I have yet to decipher the meaning of these elaborate carvings, but consider it highly strange that they occur in the deepest part of each of these ruins. The most reasonable translation of Falzardum Din I have managed to decipher is Blackest Kingdom Reaches, but I cannot imagine what that means. This of course refers to the vast subterranean world that is known as Blackreach. We know that the Dwemer of Skyrim were the deepest delvers, and in the depths of Nirn they pioneered incredible technologies and made discoveries with the potential to take their technology to a level unfathomable. However, as I have said, the Dwemer, especially those outside of Resdayn, were certainly not a united people. We have barely any historical information about the earliest days of the Dwemer civilization in Skyrim, though thanks to the work of an adventurer named Catria and her notes stolen, plagiarized, and published by Taron Dreth as the book The Aetherium Wars, we get some vitally valuable information. Using both Catria's notes, the Aetherium Wars, and the events of the Lost to the Ages quest in Skyrim, we can ascertain a clearer understanding of Dwemer politics in this region and the discovery that led to both the pinnacle of their achievement and to the ruinous depths of their despair from the Aetherium Wars. In the years following King Harold's reign, the Dwemer discovered a considerable source of Aetherium in their deepest delvings. An alliance of 4 cities led by Arkthzand, the great research center in the Southern Reach, was formed to oversee its extraction, processing, and study, and a new Aetherium forge constructed to smelt it under precisely controlled conditions. To place this more accurately in the timeline, King Harold's reign ended in 1E221, so in the years following this, the Dwemer discovered Aetherium, and an alliance between 4 city-states is formed. While this is ongoing, King Vraga the Gifted begins the Skyrim conquests in 222, which within a span of 50 years encompasses all of northern Tamriel, including most of present-day High Rock, a deep stretch of the Nibelheim Valley, and the whole of Morrowind. Now, we explain the timeline that follows without complete certainty, but I want to give you my best estimates and reasoning for them. The Aetherium Wars does not give us precise dating, nor does it give us specifics for how long the alliance of the Dwemer city-states lasted, but it does give us some fodder for estimation. The end, when it came, was swift. In the span of 3 short years, the great dwarven cities of Skyrim, from Markarth to the Velothi Mountains, fell before the armies of the High King. Cities that had held fast against the Nords for over 100 years crumbled abruptly and without warning. I believe that the Dwemer holding fast against the Nords for over 100 years is a significant statement that is said in spite of the conditions of that time. It is significant because the Skyrim conquests were happening during this time and were incredibly successful everywhere. It also makes sense that a Dwemer alliance of city-states may have been appealing for reasons other than just Aetherium, especially considering that mutual access to resources through the connecting networks of Blackreach would have been vital to their survival during this period of intense hostility. I would think then that if we were to take the end of King Harold's reign in 1E221 and the beginning of King Vraga's conquests in 1E222, we could surmise that the Nords, at the time led by King Gelir, finally conquer the Dwemer city-states of Skyrim about 1E322. The book also provides context, saying, decades of conflict merely weakened them all, allowing for King Gelir's subsequent conquests. And though the Dwemer reclaimed most of their lands a century later, there is no evidence that they ever resumed their research on Aetherium. Perhaps the costs had just been too great. Decades of conflict preceded the quick 3-year fall of the cities that held fast for a century. Decades, meaning at least 20 years before the quick fall, implies that the Dwemer alliance broke down about 1E300, meaning that we can estimate the alliance lasted for about 70-ish years, perhaps less even. But this is enough time to account for the innovations of this alliance that we shall soon discuss. As the text mentions, the Dwemer are said to have reclaimed most of their lands a century later, which, with my timeline, would place this reclamation around 1E422, which in my opinion makes perfect sense, because the Nords at this time have been experiencing internal strife with the War of Succession since 1E369, and the Nords were driven out of Morrowind by the First Council in 1E416, so it makes sense that the Dwemer would have had opportunities to reclaim old territories during this tumultuous period. Same goes for the Dwemer-Chimer alliance in Morrowind. This is my rationale for the timeline, one that I think accounts for all the context given. So we know when this Dwemer alliance rose and when it fell, but let us speak in more detail about this golden age of the Dwemer, this 70-ish year period of profound innovation and cooperation. Let us of course begin with Aetherium. Modern scholars know Aetherium as a rare luminescent blue crystal found in some Dwemer ruins. Most consider it little more than a curiosity, as it has proven all but impossible to work with. While it has a strong magical aura, it is alchemically inert, and no known process can enchant, smelt, mold, bind, or break it. To the dwarves, of course, such problems were merely a challenge. Aetherium is clearly a powerful substance, no doubt connected in some way to Aetherius, the heavenly realm beyond the sun and stars. In Skyrim, we can uncover the location of the Aetherium Forge, and we can, with first-hand experience, witness what it is capable of. It can build crowns that can harness the power of the stars, shields that can render enemies ethereal, hence ineffectual, and staves that can fabricate automatons out of thin air. The fruits of this labor must have been magnificent, technological leaps that could have reshaped conflict in the north. Let us not forget the marvels that are the Automatons, powered by Aetherium crystals. Imagine an army of these sophisticated animunculi, with legions of these as a concentrated force. But the proud Dwemer could not put aside their rivalries in the presence of such power, and so tragically, despite their advances, they fell. The alliance comprised of Arkthzand, Raldbethar, Betharzel, and Mzulft. Catria's journal has notes claiming that Site 3 marked on her map, which is the Dwemer ruin Raldbethar, was the primary source of Aetherium, and she speculated that it would be extracted from some deeper mine within. The ancient extraction tool antiquity in ESO provides additional context. 3 members of the Antiquarian Circle of the University of Gwillim's Historical Society provide analysis of the artifact. This looks like a mining tool, from somewhere around 1E240 if I had to guess. Quite sophisticated for its time, but maybe that's due to the size. This looks like a personal apparatus, not used for large-scale ore extraction, certainly. I don't think this is just any mining tool. Look at the engravings. Amalian can correct me if I'm wrong, but these look like Dwemer markings to me. This thing is unique. There's a magical component to it, or at least there used to be. Any ideas? Oh, considering where it was found and how specific the apparatus seems to be, my guess is that it was used to extract Aetherium. Raldbethar dwarves would probably have experimented with devices like this before moving on to heavier machinery. This antiquity in combination with Catria's journal leads us to the idea that Raldbethar was in fact the main site for mining, and given that it's one of the Dwemer strongholds with direct access to the vast cavern networks of Blackreach, then I'm willing to take this at face value. There is another Dwemer antiquity, the Tonal Resonation Chamber, a device that invites elaboration from members of the Antiquarian Circle. This is Aetherium, one of the rarer forms of ethereal fragment. It is only found in the caverns beneath Skyrim. How glass that falls from the sky winds up underground, I could not say. The Dwemer powered many devices with crystals such as these. Aetherium crystals powered many Dwemer marvels, yes, but this is not a simple power source. Somehow this crystal has been hollowed out. I believe this is a resonance chamber for a device harnessing Dwemer tonal magic. An incredible find. These scholars give us 2 valuable insights. One, a more direct confirmation of Aetherium being used to power their crafts, such as the Architons we have discussed before, and 2, it shows an example of tonal architecture being used in conjunction with Aetherium, something which leads to wider possibilities in speculation. For starters, I think it explains how the Dwemer were able to work with the material, despite the fact no known process can enchant, smelt, mold, bind, or break it. It does appear to be the case for the Dwemer that when in doubt, tonal architecture fills the gaps. Catria's notes also identify Mzulft as the host to the main storage facility. Catria's journal says, a storage site for raw Aetherium, just outside a major city. Apparently it had to be kept outside because the Aetherium was harmonically volatile. Lines up well with the idea that tonal architecture had been used in its manipulation, and keeping it isolated from other tonal experiments must have been important. Arkthzand is cited as the primary research center and leader of the Alliance, and Betharzel's precise role is unknown. However, these 2 cities of the Reach collaborated further with the creation of the legendary Library of Arkthzand. The scholar Naramo writes, early in the First Era, 4 dwarven cities formed an alliance or league to mine and study the arcane mineral known as Aetherium. 2 of these cities, Arkthzand and Betharzel, supposedly lie under the western foothills of the Reach. My sources suggest that in an era of discovery and prosperity, these neighbors joined together to build a great library somewhere in the depths. Many Dwemer clans came to Arkthzand to study and share their knowledge, yet in time, strife and war exploded in this hidden realm, and the peaceful library was abandoned. In amongst the depths of Blackreach caverns, amongst the mushroom forests and thickets of mist gloom, lies the great library of Arkthzand. The combined project of the city-states Arkthzand and Betharzel made profound innovations in the short-lived time for which it was active. If we consider the suggested timeline, Arkthzand would have lasted for 70 or so years before the Aetherium Wars broke out, but what is remarkable is what they achieved in that time. One of their most essential discoveries was the Dark Heart, a piece of the primordial void trapped on Nirn. It was originally in the possession of the Night Hollow clan of vampires, but by the time of the Aetherium Alliance, the Dwemer had taken possession of it, and within their newly constructed library, they built an orrery to contain it and siphon power from it for their own ends. Interestingly, there is a Dwemer item called the Arkthzand and Fractuosity Shroud, and its description is as follows. Though the helm's central focal point seems odd, perhaps it protected a dwarf from magic meant to affect the mind. Wearing it makes my thoughts feel muffled. We could speculate that these shrouds were used to protect researchers from the warping void effects that could endanger minds exposed to the Dark Heart. What insights, what profound research they gleaned from the Dark Heart, we cannot know for certain, but speculation includes the use of cosmic forces, tonal, etheric, and kinetic, to chart the expanse of the void. Perhaps the knowledge gained there about the void itself led them onto the path to disappearance. However, we should remember that the Aetherium Wars resulted in the abandonment of the library, and it was subsequently lost to history. But we know that Arkthzand was this place of shared knowledge and research where Dwemer from throughout Skyrim at least came to study. We could speculate that many of the innovations of Skyrim's Dwemer came from minds who studied in this sanctuary of scholars. After all, Blackreach is home to some other incredible technologies. Think of the Oculary found in the Tower of Mizark, a machine designed to study and read an Elder Scroll without the potential blinding, as occurs with moth priests, or the insanity that may occur when interacting with these out-of-time, ever-changing prophecies.
Deep inside their greatest knowings, Septimus is clever among men, but he is but an idiot child compared to the dullest of the Dwemer. Lucky then they left behind their own way of reading the Elder Scrolls. In the depths of Blackreach, one yet lies. 2 things I have for you, 2 shapes, one edged, one round. The round one for tuning. Dwemer music is soft and subtle, and needed to open their cleverest gates. The edged lexicon for inscribing. To us, a hunk of metal. To the Dwemer, a full library of knowings, but empty. Find Mizark and its sky dome. The machinations there will read the scroll and lay the lore upon the cube. Trust Septimus. He knows you can know.
Lexicons themselves are incredible Dwemer technology. They are devices able to store and essentially download knowledge. In this quest, a lexicon is used to safely transcribe the contents of an Elder Scroll, but there are other examples, such as the Dwemer lexicon found within the depths of Avanshanzel. You as the Dragonborn can embark on a journey to acquire the ancient knowledge contained within. In gameplay terms, it gives you a 25% bonus armor rating to Dwarven armor, and your smithing skill increases 15% faster. Of course, the lore implication is that you essentially have ancient knowledge of crafting uploaded to your brain and now can make Dwemer armor even better through superior engineering. The potential that lexicons have are incredible. We must recognize that the Dwemer of Skyrim were remarkably advanced, and curiously at a time when the Dwemer of Resdayn were essentially entering into a dark age with their domination at the hands of the First Empire of Nords. But there is even further evidence that speaks to the godly levels of advancement that the Dwemer of Skyrim had reached within those brief 70 years of alliance. Within the vast cavern networks of Blackreach, there is a Dwemer ruin called Nechuthencast, and within lies a machine that reckons with the forces of the temporal, a device that would potentially rival the Numidium itself. We have spoken of Raynor Vanos before, a scholar researching the Dwemer in the Second Era. He and his sister, Kirith, adventured far and wide to further their understanding of the Dwemer, but nothing would compare to the discovery of this machine. Temporal distortions abound the ruin as creatures from different places, different times, run rampant in its halls, and at the time of exploration, you will meet an Imperial time traveler named Thaddeus Cosma, arrayed in Dwemeri armor. Kirith and Raynor both vanish into temporal distortions, and as you progress through the quest, you will encounter Raynor, but different. He appears in a robe accented with Dwemer designs and speaks with far more knowledge than he once had. He says he got here by a miraculous confluence of temporal displacement and spatial distortion. I've seen such amazing things. If only I had the time to tell you. And if you ask him if he went back in time, he says, "Back isn't the right word for it. I understand so much more now than I once did. Don't think of time and space as a road upon which you travel, but rather a rope, or a cable, many threads, all bound together with no beginning or end." This description reminds me of a Kalpa somewhat, the idea that the end of one Kalpa is merely the beginning of the next, an endlessly winding cycle. As you progress the quest, you recover the parts for Thaddeus Cosma to fix this grand machine, and the siblings are returned. Kireth Vanos has a particularly remarkable account of what happened. "Raynor and I have been in our fair share of impossible situations, but this one, it definitely beats them all, at least when it comes to strangeness, and that's saying a lot when it comes to dwarven ruins. They're usually strange to start. I'm trying to figure that out myself. One moment I was back in Morrowind, but it was different. Vivec City was a smoking crater. The next I was underwater and struggling to breathe. Then I was falling into a volcano. Then I was here." Kireth is describing the future. She was thrown across time into the future when the city of Vivec was destroyed by the collision of Bardau and the following eruption of Red Mountain, causing Vivec City to become what is now known in the Fourth Era as Scathing Bay. This happens over 1,000 years from Kireth's time. This is also not the only example of Dwemer time-space manipulation. Of course, there is the Numidium to come, but there is also the strange case of Ragnathar. For you see, Ragnathar has numerous entrances spread across Tamriel. It is literally a space out of space, twisted out of reality. Its physical location is actually unknown. Observations made within the site suggest it was once situated within the mountains of Hammerfell, but a precise origin point has never been determined. What is known is that by stepping across the threshold into Ragnathar, you leave Nirn, and no one knows why. For indeed, the greatest question posed by Ragnathar is why? Why would the Dwemer expend the enormous amounts of magical energy required to remove a complex from known reality? I call this effort a temporospatial claudication, literally a twisting of time and space. The implications of this technology are vast and only complicate the Dwemer disappearance further. Perhaps the Dwemer are temporally displaced, perhaps outside of time. Baladas Demnavani says this about them: "As the Dwemer left no corpses or traces of conflict behind, I believe that generations of ritualistic anti-creations resulted in their immediate but foreseen removal from the Mundus. They retreated behind math, behind colour, behind the active principle itself." His beliefs about the Dwemer seem all the more plausible when you realize they had at one point the ability to harness Aetherium, a piece of the primordial void to study, an Elder Scroll, and the ability to transcribe it, as well as an actual time machine. At this point in history, that rough period of 1E222 to 1E300, the Dwemer of Skyrim were clearly the most advanced of their kind, and without a doubt this was due to their cooperation and alliance. We are left to ponder what knowledge, what research managed to survive the Aetherium Wars and the subsequent conquest by High King Gelir. We know they eventually reclaimed their lands a century later, but I personally doubt they ever reached the same significance. Funnily enough, this timeline that I have suggested could also potentially explain a discrepancy in Nuramo's writings. My findings suggest that in the decades following the establishment of peace between the Chimer and Dwemer, dwarves of Clan Kragen began to seek new holdings beyond Resdayn. Following the path laid out by the exiled Clan Rourken during their exodus, the dwarves of Kragen reached what we now consider Skyrim and first established their presence in the region with the founding of Arkthzand. It's unclear precisely what appealed so much to the Kragen explorers that it was worth settling among the hostile Nords, but in spite of regular attacks by the warlike men, their city flourished. So much so that it encouraged other clans to expand their own holdings to the west. This loose alliance of clans effectively established a pocket empire of 4 city-states that were considered unassailable, not that the Nords stopped trying. The text can make it seem as if the Dwemer arrived in Skyrim after 1E420, but we know this to be incompatible with everything else. Firstly, the Dwemer needed to be in Skyrim at the time of the Snow Elves' destruction throughout the late Merethic and early First Eras. King Harold was said to have pushed the last of the Snow Elves from the borders of Skyrim, and it was shortly after his reign that the alliance of the 4 city-states led by Arkthzand begun. So we can't have Clan Kragen founding Arkthzand, and it wasn't some fresh idea to settle amongst hostile Nords. However, if we take a different understanding, Naramo might be confused, but not entirely wrong. You see, with the rough suggested timeline I gave before, the Aetherium Forge is built around 1E300, the Alliance collapses, decades of civil war ensue, and roughly around 1E322, King Geller conquers the Dwarven city-states, who were then weakened. It is said in the book The Aetherium Wars that the dwarves reclaim most of these lands a century later, and this makes sense given a century later is 1E422. The War of Succession had broken out in Skyrim in 1E369 and was an ongoing state of affairs until the year 1E420. In that time, the First Empire of Nords crumbled, Skyrim's territories reduced to roughly the borders they have today, and the alliance of Kaima and Dwemer in Resdayn drove them out in 1E416. Nuramo's book says that Clan Kragen followed Clan Rourken, who left after the First Council was formed. This could perfectly match up with the book Aetherium Wars, as Clan Kragen was not the first Dwemer presence in Skyrim, but perhaps were the first to reclaim the lost Dwemer territories, such as Arkthzand. We can imagine that in these 2 centuries or so onwards, before their eventual disappearance, the Dwemer re-established themselves in Skyrim, but never again reached the heights of the Aetherium Alliance. So, the age of Dwemer excellence in Skyrim was largely over. There are no histories that speak of Clan Kragen as some remarkable innovator, but don't get me wrong, all Dwemer are seen as remarkable innovators when compared to the other races. But what I mean is, there are no indications that Clan Kragen inherited the knowledge of Arkthzand, which was abandoned at the time of the Alliance collapse. And 2, there is no evidence that Clan Kragen had time machines. What is said of Clan Kragen does shed some more light perhaps on their political motivations from the writings of Naramo. Perhaps it was this success, or the presence of so many nearby clans, that drove Clan Kragen to press on with their expansion west through the treacherous Dragon's Teeth Mountains. But I believe they sought to bridge their new empire with their estranged cousins in Völunnfell. Whatever the case, they broke stone for a sister city on the border of modern Hammerfell, Arkthzand's Thing. It appears to me that Clan Kragen were concerned most with exploration and establishing infrastructure. We must also question whether or not Clan Kragen was still politically affiliated with the Dwemer of Resdayn, led by King Dumac. And I'm going to suggest that they were. We are under the impression that the original Dwemer of Skyrim, those being the ones who accepted the Falmer as blinded slaves, those who mined Aetherium, built Arkthzand and so on, were politically independent from Resdayn. Consider that the Dwemer of Skyrim were politically independent from each other until the Aetherium alliance of the 4 city-states, and still even then there were Dwemer left on the outside. Curiously enough, the city of Nuchan-Zel is very prominently not mentioned in stories of the Blackreach Alliance or accounts of the so-called Aetherium War, even though it lies close to both Arkthzand and Bethar-Zel. I can only wonder at the forgotten politics of the Dwemer clans. Was Nuchan-Zel a rival to these other cities? A neutral realm? Or did the internal politics of the Blackreach League make it impossible to include a 5th member? I feel quite safe to assert the idea that Skyrim's Dwemer city-states had little to do with those of Resdayn, especially since there is no real evidence that the Dwemer of Skyrim were all that concerned with the Nordic conquest of the Resdayn Dwemer. However, the same might not be said of Clan Kragen and the re-expansion or reclamation of Skyrim's territories after the formation of the First Council. In a few sources, we have mention of an empire in regards to the Dwemer. We just read one such source where Clan Kragen supposedly sought to bridge their new empire with their estranged cousins. This could be just a manner of speech, but there are other references. In Galane's Architecture of the Second Empire, an outdated summary of historical Dwemer architecture, there is a note saying, "This is Galane Maril's outdated but entertainingly written and well-illustrated reference on late Dwemer architecture. Excerpt is from the chapter describing the Second Empire style of approaches and defenses and mentioning the common formal convention of the 4 tests." So this piece is an excerpt describing the Second Empire style of the Dwemer, and as the note implies, Second Empire is an idea more broadly identified by scholars. But the most important source we must discuss is in the words of the last living Dwemer, Yegrum Bagan. Once I was a master crafter in the service of Lord Kagrenac, chief architect of the great Second Empire freeholds, and the greatest enchanter of his time. I will return to Jaeger and Bagan later. He is an essential source when discussing the disappearance of his race, but for now I just want to focus on this Second Empire business. Jaegrim here served directly under Kagrenac, whose lord was King Dwemer. To me, this implies that King Dwemer was at the head of this Second Empire. What is more puzzling is that the Second Empire implies the presence of a first. Perhaps there was an initial empire of the Merethic era that spread into Skyrim, then later fractured, leaving Resdayn a separate entity from the city-states of Skyrim. It's all guesswork in regard to any first empire, but as for this Second Empire, I have some ideas. Naramo's writings about Clan Kragen say, they sought to bridge their new empire with their estranged cousins in Völunnfell. At first read, this may imply that Clan Kragen had an empire of their own in Skyrim, and they sought to perhaps ally with Völunnfell. But it could also be read to mean that their new empire was the Second Empire led by King Dwemer in Resdayn. Remember, Clan Kragen expanded into Skyrim after the formation of the First Council, but there is no evidence that this was some kind of exile or exodus over an ideological split, as was the case with Clan Rourken. It is possible that with the formation of the First Council and an unprecedented time of peace and prosperity established in Resdayn, expeditionary forces such as that of Clan Kragen could have been given support by King Dwemer in order to reclaim knowledge and resources lost to Dwemer kind a century earlier. This could also apply to enterprising clans of Resdayn sent forth after Kragen to continue the recolonization of these lands, and it could be speculated that they were clans whose fealty lay with King Dwemer in Resdayn, hence explaining why it was considered an empire. After all, that term necessitates some kind of expansion. I also want to point out that Naramo's text also speaks of Clan Kragen's relationship to the Rourken Dwemer as estranged cousins, which implies to me an alignment of perspective with the Resdayn Dwemer. We also have evidence of expansion going beyond the realm of Skyrim, of course discounting the exodus of the Rourken Dwemer. We have examples of expansion into the mountain regions of the northwest, including settlements beneath that reached through the Druidark Mountains that mark the border of Skyrim and High Rock, and into the regions of Hrothgar, Craglorn, and Bankurai. One particular example is the buried ruin of Zvenganaz in Hrothgar, which the scholar Thelweg speculates about. When the clan Rourken left Vvardenfell, it seems evident that several clans broke off to create their own settlements, choosing to live in greater isolation than their eastern brethren. The fact of the matter at hand is that we cannot say for sure what the political conditions of these Dwemer were. We know that Resdayn was ruled by the First Council, with Indoril Nerevar and King Dwemer at its head, and that the Dwemer were referred to as having a second empire at this time. I personally subscribe to the idea that Kragen and many of the clans that followed to Skyrim and beyond were expansions financed or supported by King Dwemer, and hence their territories belonged to the Second Empire. Also, we could headcanon somewhat that the knowledge recovered from the reclamation of Skyrim could have laid the groundwork for the Numidium, considering the temporal manipulation technologies. But again, let me just reiterate that we cannot say for certain that this is the case. However, we do have far more clarity on Clan Rourken. They have been mentioned a few times so far, and I think it's now time we fully explore what I would consider to be the third unique sphere of Dwemer civilization. Year 1E 416, the First Council was formed. It was a fragile peace, but still not one in which all were willing to participate. Chief of the Rourken clan, wielder of the mighty hammer Volendrung, an heirloom of their house, could not abide such foolishness. When the Rourkens refused to join the First Council of Keimer and Dwemer, the other Dwemer forsook them for the slight, and the Rourkens refused to stay with their people if it meant an alliance with the Keimer, their sworn enemies. So the Rourken chieftain hurled Volendrung into the sky, declaring that their people would find a home wherever it landed. Volendrung thus served as a guiding light for Clan Rourken in exile, as the hammer roared, beast-like, across the sky. It shone like a second sun during the day, mirrored the moons at night, and led the Rourken to the other side of the continent. What an incredible sight that must have been. Scholars have long speculated that this is where the name Hammerfell comes from, where the hammer quite literally fell. For the Dwemer, the place the hammer fell was in the northern stretches of the Alakir Desert, near the modern Redguard city of Satakalam. They named this place Volenfell, meaning City of the Hammer, and it became the seat of the newly made Rourken king. We are given the impression that the Rourken were a particularly austere and principled bunch, yet particularly courageous, willing to commit to an exodus across an entire continent in order to live by their values. And the exodus was not a mere stroll through the countryside, it was a hard, long travel. It would be 4 years until they reached Volendrung and the mighty crater it had left. Their journey took them across the lands of Skyrim. Thelweg suggests that Arkthzand in Skyrim was associated with the Rourken, though I'm not quite sure. Perhaps there was an association, not in its founding, but rather it could be that they were using the formerly inhabited stronghold as a base of operations as they mapped their continued exodus. Remember that at this time, given our approximate timeline for the Aetherium Wars and the following conquest of King Gela, Skyrim's Dwemer had taken a massive blow. The city-states fell, and it would not be until around this point in history that they would reclaim old lands. Perhaps there were holdouts of Dwemer scattered throughout Skyrim. Perhaps is the case with Arkthzand. After all, we need some degree of continuous civilization in order to maintain control over the Falmer slaves, and remember, Arkthzand in particular is the site of the Snow Elf statue, which more particularly shows a Falmer population was here. So maybe the Rourken simply stayed here with their Arkthzand cousins before they moved further onwards. Anyways, the association is admittedly very loose, but the Rourken were definitely moving through Skyrim, and it is here that they faced one of their most epic foes. As the once chief, now King Rourken, led his people under the shining path of Volendrung in their journey across Skyrim, they came to meet Shalidor, Archmage, a legendary Nord, uncharacteristically powerful in magic. You may be familiar with the statue in the center of the courtyard in the College of Winterhold. That is Shalidor. According to legend, King Rourken had the shield Spellbreaker fashioned for him specifically to fight the war against this legendary mage. It is a Dwemer tower shield superficially, but with enchantments capable of defending against the magical attacks of the great Shalidor. Thanks to Spellbreaker, the Rourken survived the arcane onslaught and were able to cross through Skyrim successfully, but the shield was lost in that great battle, and the next time we would see this shield is within the hands of the Daedric Prince Periite, handing it out as a gift for his champions. Though the Rourken learnt a lot from this encounter with Shalidor, and these industrious folk created the Rourken Steam Guards. Scholars believed these gauntlets were worn by the High Honor Guard of King Rourken. The tonal magics contained within were derived from the mighty Spellbreaker, and may have seen heavy use in the clan's war against Archmage Shalidor. Innovators to their core. Along the Rourken's path to Hammerfell, certain scholars believed that they were responsible for the founding of certain split-off settlements in the regions of Hrothgar and Kraglorn. We mentioned the hidden ruin of Zthenganaz before, but I don't think we can be certain that it is founded from a Rourken split. Maybe it was just another clan that followed similar to Clan Kragen. But as for Rakunzelft in the Kraglorn region, I think given its distinct architecture, it would certainly be a Rourken project, perhaps the first before the Rourken continued further in the path of Volendrung. By journey's end in year 1E 420, the Rourken arrived at the site of Volendrung, and here they founded their new kingdom, far removed from their foolish cousins of the east. But in this new land, there were foes aplenty. This is Hammerfell before the Regatta came, and before the Yakurans would lay claim to the land. In fact, the Dwemer never witnessed the Redguards. They had vanished before their time. But we do know of several groups that would have come into contact with the Rourken Dwemer. The Dyraki Needs of the Kraglorn region certainly would have had interactions with the Rourken, especially considering how close the site of Rakunzelft was. Interestingly, there is a Dyraki legend contained in the book The Footsteps of Shazar that says, Shazar, who stole stoneworking from the Dwemer and taught Zinfara to call Nerncrux from the mountain roots. The obvious implication here is that Shazar, the Nedic name for Lorkhan or Shore, stole stoneworking from the Dwemer. For extra context, the Dyraki Needs were known to be incredible stonemasons, but ultimately I don't think the Needs would have proved too difficult for the Dwemer because they certainly weren't the most dangerous in the region. Interestingly, the Rourken left Resdayn because they could not abide the foul ways of the Kaimer, those Daedra worshippers of the Velothi tradition. Well, funnily enough, it seems they could not escape the Velothi legacy. jealousy, even in Hammerfell, where they would again have to share their lands with Daedra worshippers, the Corellania clan. The Corellania were among the Elves of Somerset who secretly heeded the teachings of the prophet Veloth but did not partake in the Velothi exodus to Resdayn, unwilling to abandon the wealth and comfort of home for an arduous trek to an unknown end. But centuries later, their continued Daedra worship forced them from the Somerset Isles, and they sought a new home in Hammerfell. They settled the former Aeliad city of Salas N, year 1E 522, establishing their own kingdom. The Corellanias prospered here. Their merchant ships were friendly with Clan Durrani to the north in High Rock, and they would trade with the Wood Elf kingdoms of Valenwood. We are left to speculate what their relationship with the Dwemer of Hammerfell was like, but given that the Rourken expanded across the sea to the Isle of Stros Mackay, founding Bethzark, and even beneath the sea with a facility at Gravendeep built on the seafloor, I would be willing to speculate they inevitably came into conflict with this naval power. Mages Guild scholarship has speculated that the facility at Gravendeep was built for some kind of localized weather manipulation, perhaps something to alter the tides, to create storms, perhaps to disrupt Corellania trade, and to prevent any enemy forces shoring near Volenfell. The Mages Guild member Dulef elaborates. As for the location on the ocean floor, I almost feel like it's an issue of pride. We've found dwarven ruins beneath volcanoes, split between Nirn and Oblivion realms, frosted over in glaciers, and teetering across impossible chasms. I've even heard stories about Dwemer armor made to explore Daedric realms and sea-bottom trenches. We forget sometimes, because of all the whirling gears and fancy brass, but at their heart, the Dwemer are still Mer. It's like that old High Elf saying, if you've got the coin, show the coin. It seems strange that we never see any Dwemer boats or ports, but again, there are examples and schematics of Dwemer airships, and even more famously, using the same designs, Lord Admiral Rickton during the Tiber Wars used an airship that was built using these designs of the Dwemer. So we could imagine then, rather by boat, the Rourken Dwemer used airships to travel to Bethzark in Stros Mackay, and perhaps also to trade with other Dwemer in Craglorn, Hrothgar, and Skyrim. This way, they never had to worry about the maintenance of roads, at least above ground, and they could simply hop from stronghold to stronghold. But Hammerfell at this time was dominated by one race in particular, one that would have proven troublesome during the time of the Rourken, for when the Regatta came, they too would face hordes of this enemy. I am of course talking about the goblin hordes of Hammerfell. In these ancient days, the goblins were said to have been much larger and fiercer than the creatures we know today. Here they were led by Malooc, the Horde King, which is broadly believed to be another name or incarnation of Malacath, the Daedric Prince of Curses and patron to orcs. There are tales aplenty about the epic battles between the Yakudans and the hordes of Malooc, but this occurs after the disappearance of the Dwemer, and so it is not unreasonable to speculate that the Rourken Dwemer would have certainly faced down the giant goblins during their time in Hammerfell. One additional bit of evidence is Volendrung itself. Volendrung, of course, is the mighty hammer of the Rourken king, but since the Dwemer disappearance, it is Malacath who has claimed the artifact as his own. I like to speculate that the Rourken and Malacath as Malooc the Horde King were at odds for centuries, and much to the frustration of Malacath, the might of his goblin hordes could not overcome the ingenuity and defenses of the Dwemer. I imagine a stalemate for years until one day the Dwemer simply vanished, and Malacath could waltz into the throne of Volenfell and take the hammer of his foe as his own, perhaps to gloat, perhaps to remember this ancient war which he was never able to finish. Some scholars dismiss the idea that the Volendrung of the Rourken and the Volendrung of Malacath are the same thing, but personally I disagree. There was both motive and opportunity for Malacath to claim this artifact as his own. There is no evidence that the Rourken Dwemer ever reconciled with King Dumac of Resdayn. The closest non-Rourken settlement was Arkhamtham's Fing, later known as Fang Lair, which was the project of Clan Kragen. Whether or not Clan Kragen ever succeeded in bridging their empire with their estranged Volenfell cousins, as Naramo suggests, we cannot know. But ultimately, despite this political disunity and divergence, none were saved from their fate. The disappearance affected all Dwemer, from the towers of Vardenfell to the depths of Blackreach and the halls of Volenfell. All Dwemer vanished instantly, one fateful day in 1E 700. We are left only to theorize. Was it something genetic, soul-related, metaphysical erasure? I can understand why some of the Dwemer disappeared, given Kagrenac's experimentation, But why did this affect all Dwemer? One potential answer lies within a specific ability that the Dwemer were said to have shared: the Calling. In the Ancient Tales of the Dwemer, Volume 6, Kaimar Vermidium, the publisher's note speaks of a very interesting theory. Another aspect of this legend that scholars like myself find interesting is the mention of the Calling. In this legend, and in others, there is a suggestion that the Dwemer race as a whole had some sort of silent and magical communication. There are records of the Psijic Order which suggest they too share this secret. Whatever the case, there are no documented spells of calling. The Cyrodiil historian Borgacillus Mallia first proposed this as a solution to the disappearance of the Dwemer. He theorized that in 1E668, the Dwemer enclaves were called together by one of their powerful philosopher-sorcerers, Kagrenac in some documents, to embark on a great journey, one of such sublime profundity that they abandoned all their cities and lands to join the quest to foreign climes as an entire culture. The calling is thought to be some kind of innate trait, and we could speculate that it is some kind of ancient ability, as might be indicated by the idea that the Dwemer were, according to Baladas, researching the Earthbones at the dawn, and that the Psijics adhere to the old ways closest to the ancient Aldmeri. Perhaps there is some common connection. After all, the Dwemer and the Psijics have the conception of godhood as a spectrum, rather than this strict delineation separating divine from mortal. However, I will say that this feels flimsy, and the Psijics would certainly have magic that could provide telepathic communication, perhaps not needing this innate ability explanation. But I want to suggest another idea. We could conceptualize this calling as an attunement with one another, perhaps an ability gained downstream of experimenting with tonal forces for generations. We could imagine that as these Dwemer experimented with and are exposed to tonal forces on the regular, that they have developed a sort of resonance with one another. Perhaps it was not a side effect at all and was an intentionally created ability. Imagine previous generations of Dwemer toying with tonal forces, altering their own biology in order to create this ability. Consider what we discussed earlier in the video. The Dwemer used sound in mining, medicine, architecture, even psychology. The Dwemer used tonal machines in all fields and even had machines that could alter the psychology of enemies, using oral techniques to dominate their minds. Perhaps this similar field of research at one point was used upon themselves, to alter their minds, attuning them to tonal forces, granting them a kind of silent telepathy as a result of their changed brains, now attuned to one another, resonating with one another. We can sit and speculate about the origins of this ability, but what we can identify from pieces of recovered Dwemer tech is that the calling was not some cross-world telepathic ability, at least not without technology. We have recovered examples of different helms called mitres, which were used in long-range communications, from the description of the Dwarven visor mitre. Use of the term mitre for this Dwemer headgear is a misnomer, as the dwarves were a secular race without a priesthood. The originals of these visors are believed to have magically amplified thought projection, or calling. Now, I want to zoom in on the phrasing here. Magically amplified thought projection. In my reading of this, it seems to be talking about the amplification of thought projection, but not the origin of the thought projection itself. For example, I can't project my thoughts without speaking, so a device that magically amplifies thought projection would presumably not work for me. Now, I could be wrong, and the Dwemer are really just hopping on the telephone, and the calling is explained by way of technology. But I want to quickly establish that the idea of the calling as a strictly technological phenomenon largely makes the calling defunct as an explanation for why they all disappeared. If you essentially had to be online wearing a helmet in order to pick up the signal that made all of the Dwemer disappear, why did some not remain? There would be children playing, or people bathing, or the sick and infirm. We can't seriously imagine that every single Dwemer was wearing a headset, every Dwemer ruin just a telemarketer office at the time of the disappearance. It just seems silly to me. And also, Bam's Amschent shows this not to be the case, but we'll explore that later. So in my books, either the calling is an innate ability amplified by the miters, or it is a strictly technological innovation that requires use of the miters, and therefore is not a sufficient explanation for why all the Dwemer disappeared. I tend to fall in the innate ability camp, again, amplified thought projection, not grants the user thought projection. Also, consider the functions of the other kinds of miters. The description of the Dwarven Spiked Miter says, though the spikes of this so-called miter look aggressive, scholars of the long-lost Dwemer believe they actually functioned as etheric antenna, helping to pull in long-distance thought calls. Again, this description to me makes it sound specific in usage, to pull in long-distance thought calls. It gives me the impression that the innate ability, the resonance of the Dwemer minds, or calling, did not have an endless range, and it had to be extended with technology. Consider the Dwarven Master Miter, of which is said, "This is a replica of the headgear scholars of the dwarves believe was worn by the Tuathums, or central pylon of their thought-calling system. The three finials are either broadcast foci or convenient tabs for wall hanging." All of this evidence together describes different headgear technology that was used to create a telepathic network between the Dwemer. If the calling was an innate trait amplified by these tools, then it would sufficiently explain how every Dwemer could be connected in some way that a signal or resonance or whatever metaphysical phenomenon happened at Red Mountain could be transmitted to all Dwemer, hence they could all vanish at once. Imagine these miters as nodes or routers in a network which can spread or receive localized thought projections across vast distances. In this way, we can imagine that every hold or settlement of the Dwemer had at least one individual equipped with a miter within range of the telepathy, hence why even the children or people bathing would have instantly vanished also. This is one explanation for why all the Dwemer disappeared that fateful day. All except one. Yagrum Bagan is the last of the Dwemer. At the time of the disappearance, he says that he was in an outer realm, and this would explain why he was perhaps out of range of the calling. It also complicates the idea that there was some universal metaphysical principle that erased the Dwemer from all of existence. The presence of dwarven spectres in some ruins also complicates that. But for the moment, let us glean all we can from the insights of Yagrum Bagan. When we meet Yagrum in the Corpusarium beneath Tel Fir, we find him to be a distorted creature. His body is bloated beyond recognition, corpulent and gangrenous. His legs have failed him, and he moves on a mechanical spider frame of his own design. He is unfortunately a poor reference for the appearance of the Dwemer race. We can speak to him about the disappearance of his people, and he has this to say. I cannot say what happened. I was not there to observe. I was in an outer realm at the time, and when I came back, my people were gone. I left Red Mountain wandering Tamriel for years, searching our deserted colonies, looking for a survivor or an explanation. Then, a long, long time ago, I returned to Red Mountain, still looking for answers. Instead, I found Corpus disease, and I have been here ever since. Yagrum has spent thousands of years searching, presumably leaving no stone unturned, venturing to the farthest colonies only to find no trace. Even he, familiar with Dwemer technology and culture, could not explain why Dwemer had vanished. You can ask for Yagrum's insight on several Dwemer texts. Divine Metaphysics is an explanation of the Numidium's construction written in Dwemeris. Yagrum says, "This book is just an explanation of some of Kagrenac's theories. I could spend hours explaining them to you, but Kagrenac is dead, and I believe his theories must die with him." This is fascinating because it reveals discontent amongst the Dwemer. When you give him the book Egg of Time, a refutation of the idea that the use of Lorkhan's heart involved unjustifiable risks, Yagrum Bagan can elaborate. The Dwemer were not unified in their thinking. Kagrenac and his tonal architects, among them Bethuand Mizanch, believed they could improve the Dwemer race. Others argued that the attempt would be too great a risk. The war with Nerevar and the Dunmer may have led Kagrenac to carry out his experiments prematurely. Although this book argues that nothing disastrous could result, the disappearance of my race argues otherwise. Baladas, the age-old Dunmer sorcerer and Dwemer expert, says this about divine metaphysics. This is an explanation of how the Dwemer tried to make a new god, a Numidium, using Kagrenac's tools and the sacred tones on Lorkhan's heart. It has several interesting theories about how to bend the Elnefey, or Earth Bones, but I am not entirely sure I understand it myself. Perhaps after another century of study, I could have a better answer for you. There is subtle variation here on the explicit purpose of the book. Baladas says it was an explanation of how they went about creating a new god, whereas Yegrim uses the phrasing, to improve the Dwemer race. It's worth noting that Yegrim was a master crafter in the service of Lord Kagrenac and knew him personally, so I would perhaps lean on Yegrim's summary more, but the two claims are not entirely irreconcilable. More on that later. I could not match the genius of Lord Kagrenac, but what he could envision, I and my colleagues could build. All of that is gone forever. I still retain my cunning, but my hands and eyes fail me, and my memories have long faded. My only consolation is each day to mock the gods who destroyed my race and condemned me to this bleak existence. Interestingly here, Yegrim seems to cast blame at the gods who destroyed his race. I am unsure if he means to cast direct blame or if he speaks of an indirect consequence, or if he means someone like Azura specifically. After all, she did motivate Nerevar to take action against the Dwemer. This quote does, however, lay out cleanly the attitude of the Dwemer towards the gods. The only reason I don't take this at face value is because he says otherwise at another point in conversation. Lord Kagrenac, the foremost arcane philosopher and magecrafter of my era, devised tools to shape mythopoeic forces, intending to transcend the limits of Dwemer mortality. However, in reviewing his formulae, some logicians argued that side effects were unpredictable and errors might be catastrophic. I think Kagrenac might have succeeded in granting our race eternal life, with unforeseen consequences, such as wholesale displacement to an outer realm, or he may have erred and utterly destroyed our race. Yegrim speculates here that it could have been an error and Kagrenac had destroyed his race, but he is more inclined to think that Kagrenac succeeded in granting the Dwemer eternal life, yet with unforeseen consequences. Yegrim seems clear about the intention of the Numidium and the use of the Heart of Lorkhan. They were to offer transcendence for the Dwemer, an immortality, a divinity, an improvement to the Dwemer race. That was at least the intention. Both the Numidium and the Heart of Lorkhan were vitally important for the designs of Kagrenac, but just before we get into the Numidium and finally try to determine an answer to the disappearance, I want to discuss the perspective of a god. Famously, the Tribunal, Almalexia Vivec and Sothasil, after the Dwemer disappeared, used the Heart of Lorkhan to make themselves into living gods. These individuals were in the Council of Nerevar and they witnessed the Battle of Red Mountain personally. But now they are also tapped into the world of the divine. The god Vivec has several insights about the Dwemer. The sin of the Dwemer was the creation of a new god from the substance of a dead god, Lorkhan. This is of course referring to the Numidium as an artificial deity built from the corpse of a divine. He is sure of their iniquity but is unable to account for their disappearance. When asked about the Dwemer, he replies, "I have no idea what happened to the Dwemer. I have no sense of them in the timeless divine world outside of mortal time, and in fact, if I did believe they existed, I would be in no hurry to make contact with them. They may, with some justice, hold the Dwemer race responsible for their fate. My intuition is that they are gone forever, and that is perfectly fine with me." This is profoundly important because it suggests that even in this timeless divine world, one that is outside mortal time, that there are still no traces of the Dwemer. It also leads me to believe that none of the Daedra or other divinities have any knowledge of the Dwemer's whereabouts. It makes me think again of what Baladas Demnavani says. I believe that generations of ritualistic anti-creations resulted in their immediate but foreseen removal from the Mundus. They retreated behind math, behind colour, behind the active principle itself. That the Dwemer vanished during a conflict with Nerevar and the Tribunal is merely coincidence. Behind the active principle itself. Baladas seems to describe the Dwemer as becoming an abstraction, something behind reality altogether. Perhaps he is correct. After all, even Vivec cannot detect the Dwemer outside of mortal time, by which I think is meant outside the linear time of the Kalpa. Allow me this brief tangent outside the lore, but this concept reminds me of Terence McKenna's Clockwork Elves. Terence McKenna was an ethnobotanist, philosopher, and explorer of consciousness who died in the year 2000. He spent his life investigating altered states of mind, particularly those induced by psychedelic compounds, and in his journeys to strange inner spaces, he encountered something that is remarkably comparable to the Dwemer. Terence said, "I encounter self-transforming elf machines, which are creatures, entities perhaps, although they are not made out of matter. They are made out of, as nearly as I can figure it out, syntax driving light." Syntax driving light. Language made luminous. Information given form. McKenna elaborated on his entities. They use a language which you see. It is made out of sound. It is sound, but you see it. Sound that becomes sight, a visible language, frequencies that manifest as perception itself. This is what the Dwemer mastered, the manipulation of the fundamental harmonics underlying reality, tonal architecture. The Dwemer understood that reality itself is a song, and they learned to sing new verses into existence. I do wonder if McKenna's Clockwork Elves were in part the inspiration for the Dwemer, and if this is the case, then perhaps it gives us insight into the thematically appropriate end of the Dwemer that Balladas claims. Behind math, behind colour, behind the active principle itself. Surprise, surprise, we cannot say for certain that this was the fate of the Dwemer, but it is one of several possibilities. We could probably go ahead and call this the Abstraction Theory, or the Clockwork Elves Theory, but at its core is the idea that the Dwemer transcended reality itself, both divine and mortal, and moved into some level of abstraction that no god, man, or mer can follow. If the origin theory we spoke about at the beginning of this video has any weight to it, then this abstraction theory could have been the ultimate solution to escape the Kalpic cycles, but again, it's entirely theoretical. Ultimately, this abstraction theory is quite similar to the zero-sum theory. The concept of zero-sum is perhaps as dubious as the concept of Kim, and by dubious, I mean there is scant mention of the actual term in lore, and a lot of unofficial lore explanations are needed to supplement our understanding, but of course that alters our ability to treat it as strictly canon. To be clear, there is one explicit literary reference that I am aware of, which is in the Mythic Dawn commentaries by Menkar Cameron. Endlessly it shall form and reform around you, deeds as entities, all systems only an hour before they bloom to zero sums, flowering like vestments, divine raiment worn to dance at Lord Dagon's golden feet. Further context can be inferred from the frameworks surrounding Kim presented in the 36 Lessons of Vivec, but zero-sum is not explicitly mentioned. In the out-of-canon text Et Arda, Et Adra, Eat the Dreamer, written by Michael Kirkbride, a foundational member of the team that made the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, there is a subtitle that reads, "Transcribed from a spore dream of an unidentified, evaporating moth priest that reached zero-sum." This explains that an individual, the moth priest in this case, reaching zero-sum means evaporation, to disappear. This is a huge video, and so I'm just going to infer the briefest summary possible without going into the details. There is a state of enlightenment that an individual in the Elder Scrolls universe can reach. This enlightenment is the revelation that reality is illusory, that reality is inherently mythological. Some sources point to the idea that the entirety of reality is the dream of an unknowable entity called the Godhead. When faced with this knowledge, there are mainly two options. Kim is the state where one can, despite the evidence of the contrary, irrationally claim, I am, I do exist, and in community understanding, this is likened to being a lucid dreamer, giving you profound control over reality. It is said that Tiber Septim changed Cyrodiil from jungle to fertile heartland with this power. However, on the flip side, if, when faced with this reality, and you cannot irrationally vouch for your own existence, then it causes the zero-sum, a state in which you essentially rationalized yourself out of existence, and thus you disappear. Considering that the Dwemer are a race driven by reason and logic, it stands to reason that they, when faced with the illusory nature of reality, would zero-sum. Now, this is a plausible theory, but it does rely more heavily on out-of-law conclusions, and in function, it's not all too dissimilar to the abstraction theory that we've spoken of in terms of consequence. By that I mean they are well and truly vanished, not perceptible within reality by God or man. Some, such as Vivec, would identify the Dwemer adherence to pure reason and logic as a critical flaw, especially in a world that is actively shaped by mythology and beliefs. In the 36 Lessons of Vivec, there is a parable about the Dwemer where they attempt to remove the egg of Vivec that was within the Netchman's pregnant wife. Yes, this is a little weird, but bear with it because it's the philosophical point that is made which enlightens us. From Sermon 3. In the darkness, the Netchman's wife felt great knives try to cut her open. When the knives did not work, the Dwemer used solid sounds. When those did not work, great heat was brought to bear. Nothing was of any use, and the egg of Vivec remained safe within her. A Dwemer said, "Nothing is of any use. We must go and misinterpret this." To shorten this tale, the Dwemer are unable to penetrate the egg of Vivec. Quote, "To confound his captors, he channeled his essence into love, an emotion the Dwemer knew nothing about." And after the Dwemer had given up, one said, "We Dwemer are only aspirants to this that the Velothi have." Weird story, I know. I'm not going to get into the lessons now, but this is written with a critique of the Dwemer in mind. It presents the Dwemer as entirely logic-driven, using tools, heat, and tonal architecture to try and penetrate the egg of Vivec, but when it all failed, when the powers of reason, their machines, their methods, failed to penetrate the egg, they are left to misinterpret this experience. The idea is that when the Dwemer come up against something that confounds their reason, such is the case with the egg of Vivec and its resistance through love, they misinterpret the lesson. The lesson being that logic and reason alone cannot explain nor thrive in a world of the mythic. When the Dwemer come up against the unexplainable via reason or logic, they cannot embrace belief. They cannot be carried by faith and love alone, as the Velothi are, and this is why, in this parable, the Dwemer are aspirants to what the Velothi have. This kind of thinking is perhaps why they, when reaching some supposed state of enlightenment when Kagrenac strikes the heart with the tools, zero-summed. Michael Kirkbride wrote a post in 2004 explaining more of the Dwemer mindset, and it helps provide some clarity. In Tamriel, and specifically the dwarves, that aspect is what I can only call heroic abrogation of everything, a complete and utter refusal to accept what everyone else experiences as the real. That's why the Dwemer are the weirdest race in Tamriel, and, frankly, also the scariest. They looked like us, they sometimes acted like us, but when you really put them under the magnifying glass, you see nothing but vessels that house an intelligence and value system that is by all accounts beyond human comprehension. Dwarves were the ultimate Bartlebys of the universe. Whenever it asked something of them, they simply would rather not. Let me take this a step further and say dwarves regularly practiced the perception of acausal effects. Dwarves knew that phenomena, that which can be perceived by the senses, and noumena, that which is the thing itself, were both illusions, with the second one just being more clever. Dwarves could divide by zero. There isn't even a word to describe the dwarven view on divinity. They were atheists on a world where gods exist. Kirkbride provides some valuable insight here, but ultimately, the fatal flaw of the Dwemer is they believe reality should be a fixed framework of laws dictated by reason and logic, which never holds up to scrutiny in a mythopoeic universe. Hence, they cannot help but chafe against reality itself, concluding that all is illusory. The Elder Scrolls universe is a place where gods verifiably exist, yet their existence is contingent on mutually exclusive, contradictory versions of creation. It is a place where individuals such as Tiber Septim or Vivec could achieve Kim, insisting upon their own existence even in spite of the overwhelming evidence telling them the contrary. They believed so hard in the myth of themselves that they became gods. The Dwemer just cannot do this. Their conception of reality, as dictated by reason and logic alone, fails to account for reality as it is, which is mythic by nature. Therefore, they conclude it is illusory. They are nihilists, in a sense, who lived in a world determined in part by reason, yes, but one that is ultimately malleable, moldable, and mythical. So far we have danced around the Numidium, but now it's time to look at Walkbrass, the walking star, the prime Gestalt, the brass god. It is a 1,000-foot golem or atronach of sorts, a machine made more than by the divinity flayed from the heart of Lorkhan itself. Of what is said about the Dwemer and the Numidium by Yegrum Bagan, Vivec, and Baladas Demnavani all suggest that the Numidium was a vessel for transcendence, whether that be an escape of Mundus, the whole abstraction theory, or through a kind of unified apotheosis via this construction. Briefly, I want to get everyone up to speed on what we can definitively say about the Numidium. Firstly, its activations cause temporal distortions. It breaks time. It causes dragon breaks. Now, quick recap on dragon breaks. Akatosh and his cultural variations is or are the dragon god of time. So when the dragon breaks, time breaks. The warp in the west, which is the result of the rebuilt Numidium's activation at the end of the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, ends up creating a scenario where the multiple endings of that game are reconciled into the miracle of peace. In some sense, it's the ultimate retcon machine, but from an in-law perspective, it is a time-shattering construct. While not explicitly stated, the Battle of Red Mountain, where Kagrenac activated the Numidium, has many versions of its events and outcomes, some wildly so, and they are largely non-reconcilable. Knowing that the Numidium can cause such fractures of time, it is not unreasonable to conclude that the Battle of Red Mountain also involved a dragon break. But perhaps one of the most significant uses of the Numidium was that of Tiber Septim. Tiber Septim, during his wars of conquest in the late Second Era, had but two foes remaining, the Dark Elves of Morrowind and the High Elves of Valinor. Morrowind was first on the list, but there was a complicated situation, one not fully realised by Morrowind's populace. The tribunal of Almalexia, Vivec, and Sotha-Sil had been cut off from the heart of Lorkhan by the reawakening of Dagoth-Ur, and this meant that they could not renew their powers, and so Vivec, with his foresight, proposed a cessation of the war, a treaty, an armistice. Nothing is known of the circumstances of the personal meeting between Septim and Vivec, or where it took place, or the preliminaries which must have preceded the treaty. The public reason was to protect the identities of the agents involved. In the West, speculation is centered around the role of Zurin Arctus in brokering the agreement. In the East, rumors suggest that Vivec offered Numidium to aid in the conquest of the Altmora and Somerset Isle in return for significant concessions to preserve self-rule, house traditions, and religious practices in Morrowind. Regardless of the details, Tiber Septim was given possession of the Numidium, and with his imperial battle mage Zurin Arctus, he began its reconstruction in the halls of the Colossus in Elsewhere. This was to be his superweapon, but Tiber Septim and his accomplices did not have the heart of Lorkhan. They did not have such a powerful vessel of divinity to power the Numidium, so a substitute was required. The Mantella was a soul gem of unusual size and power. This was the substitute. What exactly, or more accurately, who exactly it contained is a matter of historical dispute. The orthodox accounts suggest that it was infused with the life force of Zurin Arctus, but there is another story, one that in my opinion makes more sense. That is the Arcturian heresy. The heresy claims that the Mantella held something far more potent, the soul of Izmir Wulfarth, the Ash King. No ordinary mortal. He had died and returned multiple times across the eras, blasted to ash by the Greybeards, scattered at Red Mountain, and yet always reforming. The 5 songs of King Wulfarth tell us that Shor himself brought him back to lead divine armies. The Nords call him Shor's tongue. Some scholars name him Shezarene, one of the mortal incarnations of Lorkhan, walking echoes of the dead god. If this account is true, then the Mantella did not contain a mere soul. It contained something closer to divinity, the essence of a being the Arcturian heresy itself describes as not exactly Lorkhan. To me, it is far more believable that this brass god could be powered by the soul of a Shezarene, something closer to Lorkhan but not quite as powerful as the heart itself. The Arcturian heresy says, the Numidium, while not the god Tiber Septim and the Dwemer hoped for, the Underking was not exactly Lorkhan after all, it does the job. After its work on Somerset Isle, a new threat appears, a rotting undead wizard who controls the skies. He blows the Numidium apart, but it pounds him into the ground with its last flailings, leaving only a black splotch. The Mantella falls into the sea, seemingly forever.
There are many avenues of theory we could go down in regards to Tiber Septim and his rise, but now is not the time for that. The key takeaway is that the Mantella containing the soul of a Shezarene is an approximate, yet perhaps not complete, replacement for the Heart of Lorkhan. There was no Kagrenac at the helm of this project, nor a genius that could rival him. But what could be accomplished with Kagrenac and the master crafters of the Dwemer at the head of such a project, especially with access to the Heart of Lorkhan itself? We are again back to the realm of endless speculation, but perhaps it is time to dip into some of the less official sources to try and determine what could have happened. I personally lend this following text a lot of credence because it is a series of interviews between the interviewer and the locals of Morrowind written by Michael Kirkbride and Ken Rolston in 1999 before Morrowind was even released. Kirkbride at this time was also still working for Bethesda, so I tend to treat it a little bit different to other texts of Kirkbride which were written after his tenure. Anyways, within this text there is a character called Zal, a human Marukati. Marukati are a kind of elite selective group of the ancient Elysian Order. Think like Freemason, secret occult type energy, at least in the context of the Third Era especially. Zal says the following when the interview inquires about the Brass God. "Ah, I will tell you the truth, because you will believe none of it. The Brass God is Numidium, the prime Gestalt. He is also called the Divine Skin. He was meant to be used many times by our kind to transcend the Grey Maybe. The first to see him was the shop former, Kagrenac of Vvardenfell, the wisest of the tonal architects. Do not think, as others do, that Kagrenac created the Numidium for petty motivations, such as the refutation of the gods. Kagrenac was devoted to his people, and the dwarves, despite what you may have read, were a pious lot. He would not have sacrificed so many golden souls to create Numidium's metal body if it were all in the name of grand theatre. Kagrenac had even built the tools needed to construct a Mantella, the crux of transcendence. But by then, and for a long time coming, the doom of the dwarves marched upon the mountains, and they were removed from this world." Zal here suggests that the Dwemer themselves became the skin of the Numidium. Their, quote, golden souls became the metal body. This is what is meant by the term prime Gestalt. Gestalt means something like an organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. If this prime Gestalt idea is correct, then the entirety of the Dwemer race has been combined into the divine skin, the metal body of the Numidium, and together they become something more. They become the Numidium, the brass god. Zal also specifically states that the Numidium was not just some middle finger to the gods, it was not about some petty flex, it was a serious endeavor dedicated to the transcendence of the Dwemer race. This is the crux of the divine skin theory, or you could call it the Dwemer became the Numidium theory. They did not create a god separate from them, they became the brass god. Now, just before we start moving on to some of the much weirder metaphysical coda-type stuff, I just want to ground ourselves in the theories we have going for us at the moment. Each of these theories needs to somewhat account for the disappearance of the entire race, so this means that there must be some kind of practical method of connection, like the suggested innate calling ability and their neural network, or something metaphysical, something that can identify souls perhaps, something that can stretch out across Nirn and combine all the, quote, golden souls of the Dwemer. All the disappearance theories hinge on some method of ubiquitous and instantaneous disappearance, but as for the actual reasons that they disappeared, these are the theories. The first and one I find the most boring and thematically dull is the error theory, where basically Kagrenac was forced during the Battle of Red Mountain to prematurely activate his experiment and hence he destroyed his entire race. It was all just a big mistake. While technically this is a separate theory, I kind of bundle the zero-sum theory into this one. Remember, this is the idea that they reached enlightenment through attempted transcendence, but when faced with the true nature of reality, that is illusory, fictitious, mythic, their reason and logic could not account for their own existence, and so they zero-summed. The logical conclusion is that they could not exist, and so it was. Both the error and zero-sum theories are fail states, and really they are not theories that I find thematically satisfying for the Dwemer. This is not necessarily a reason to discount them as possibilities, they're valid, just less thematically satisfying, I think. The other theories are grouped into the broader category of success states. This includes the Abstraction theory, the idea that the Dwemer achieved their transcendence, they are part of a sub-reality, behind math, behind colour, behind the active principle. This also explains why gods such as Vivec have no sense of them, even in the timeless world of the divine. But it could be that Vivec cannot sense them, because he does not understand what they have become. To be fair, the other theory, the prime Gestalt or divine skin theory that we just discussed, is just as abstract. If the Dwemer souls did actually unite in this brass god and became a unified new being, the Numidium, then perhaps that is why the Dwemer can no longer be sensed, because they have undergone a fundamental transformation. They are no longer Dwemer, they are the Numidium. This is the theory that I think provides the basis for the Numidium as it appears in Coda. What follows draws on an unofficial text, a script for what was to be a graphic novel. Coda was written by Michael Kirkbride, one of the architects of the deep lore that makes this world so strange. Coda has never been endorsed by Bethesda, it is not canon in any official sense. However, the canonical Sermon 37 of the Lessons of Vivec does allude to the events of Coda, and at the end of the day, Coda was written by someone who helped build the mythology. But most importantly, Coda was designed to resist canonical authority entirely. Kirkbride released it as a statement about open source mythology, the idea that the Elder Scrolls universe belongs to everyone who engages with it, that interpretation is not merely permitted but essential. And after all, Bethesda has made clear that the Dwemer mystery will remain so, hence there will never be a canon answer. With that said, let us indulge in the story. Coda imagines an ending. The story speaks of a future in the far-off 5th era when Nirn has been destroyed by the rampages of the Numidium. The Dwemer survivors have fled to Massa, one of the moons, where they live in underground caverns and wait for the end. Now, Coda is pretty strange, and it may not be palatable to all, but I just want to distill that which is relevant to the Numidium itself and its purpose. Jubal Lun Sul is a Dwemer noble of his time. He is ecstatic because the daughter of High Alma Jarun agreed to marry him, meaning he would marry into the ruling house. But because he is from a salt merchant caste, he must prove himself worthy. He seeks to hunt and kill the Numidium. Long story short, Jubal ends up facing the Numidium, and in the climactic confrontation, something unexpected happens. Jubal does not simply fight the Numidium, he talks to it. Throughout their exchange, the Numidium's speech balloons are empty. Not words, not even just the word no, just the shape of language with nothing inside, silence given visible form. It has nothing to say because its only statement is absence, and absence requires no elaboration. But Jubal keeps talking. He recites scripture according to the codes of Mafala and is interrupted by an empty speech balloon once more. Jubal says, "I know, every other word makes you angry. Wrong word, every assertion does. But just hear it out." And then he continues, despite the Numidium. "The one-handed king finds no remedy. When you approach God, however, cut both of them off. God has no need of theory, and he is armored head to toe in terror." It's literary and portentous, I get that, but the alternative, the words of yours, those are easy. Jubal proceeds to simply say no 5 more times in repetition. No, 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 no. I mean, really, you're just being a brat. Your philosophy is, for a lack of a better term, the entitled teenager. I know you wanted it to be something else, something more pure maybe, like never underestimate the little guy, but that just sucks too. It gets you nowhere. Got us to this. Everyone ran here to get away from you, to avoid you. Landfall, day one. But at some point in time, we all have to grow up. Jubal continues to speak to the Numidium, reciting the history and purpose of the Numidium, its role as a manifestation of pure negation. He walks closer to the Numidium. And the whole time, you were the escape route. You are the disappearance of the dwarves. Wasn't that hard to figure out, mainly because other people did before me. But there was always this one unanswered question, tickling in the back brains. Why do you keep coming back? Red Mountain, Alinor, reclaiming all the tone shouts from Altmora that they took from you. Stomping, to put it kindly, all of Hammerfell into the ocean to, I don't know, remind people of their history? And then you chased us here. What's the goddamn point? I mean, really. And I'm really asking because no one ever has been, I think, brave enough. Do you have some kind of unfinished business? The Numidium answers, not with silence, not with an empty speech balloon. It speaks, maybe. Drubal presses, the Numidium hedges, grey area, grey maybe. And then Drubal accuses it. You just wanted to win! The god of negation finally concedes. It says, yes. The brass god affirms something. After aeons of refusal, of persistent destruction across timelines, utter denial, it finally admits what it wanted. To win. Victory. Finally, Drubal says. Thank you, and I'm sorry. The Numidium cocks its head. Drubal almost looks sorry for it. Don't you get it? Your people tried to run, but couldn't. My people have to run, and I needed to hear the way out. We're finally talking the same language. In that moment, Drubal kills it, not with a blade, not with a thumb, but with an empty speech balloon of his own. The god that spoke only in negation is silenced by someone who finally got it to say yes. Negation answered with negation, silence with silence. Numidium destroyed by someone willing to use its own weapon, but only after forcing it to mean something, to affirm something, to make it participate in discourse even as it refused discourse's validity. How about that, huh? Coda is controversial, A, because it's an unofficial source, but B, because admittedly it's very meta and self-aware. You do not have to adopt this into your headcanon, but I do think Coda does provide some thematic insight for the Dwemer. In Coda, the Dwemer became the Numidium. They became the brass god of negation, a denial of reality as it was, a refusal of this mythic landscape. It travelled across time and space, denying reality and thereby destroying it, singing world refusals. Kirkbride, the author of Coda, and of course one of the key developers of Morrowind, once described Dwemer belief as negalithic, refusatronic, world navel gazenism. A joke, yes, but one that cuts to the heart of what they were in his mind. A religion of no, a faith built on the denial of faith, and faith or belief is a cornerstone of the mythic landscape that is the Elder Scrolls. Reason alone is not sufficient in the world of the Elder Scrolls, and adhering to that principle alone is sure to condemn you to the path of the Dwemer. Ultimately, this conception of the Numidium relies more heavily on Coda and Kirkbride's writings on the Dwemer, but there are canon sources that plant the seeds of these ideas, such as their pursuit of reality-bending technologies like that of tonal architecture and their declared opposition to the foolish rituals of the Chimera and more broadly the gods themselves, such as in the story of Azura and the Box, as well as the words of Yeager and Bagan. So, what do I think? Which of the theories best fits? Well, before we get to that, there is one last spanner in the works, one last bit of evidence we have to contend with. I am speaking of the Dwarven Spectres. The Dwemer have vanished. Did they blink out of existence without a trace, or were they turned to ashes, Thanos snap style, as the ruin of Bam's Amschand may imply? Deep beneath the city of Mournhold in Morrowind, there lies the Dwemer ruins of Bam's Amschand, undisturbed and untouched since their disappearance. That is until the Nerevarine adventures their way through them. Here we see sets of Dwemer armor and weapons about piles of ash, and similar piles of ash are on the ground beside tools, in seats, before books, and in other places. The implication here is that the Dwemer basically got Thanos snapped, leaving behind only ashes. Now perhaps in other Dwemer ruins these ashes were disturbed and blew around, and perhaps there were once Dwemer armor and weapons that just dropped on the spot besides the ash piles, but these Dwemer ruins were at one point simply plundered in the ages since their disappearance. Bam's Amschand is a mostly undisturbed Dwemer ruin, so maybe the lack of ash piles and armor in other ruins can be reconciled this way. Now, this may seem like a minor point, and perhaps it is. Either way, they vanished, but seemingly not all of them did. In Bam's Amschand, Dwemer Spectres, hostile translucent apparitions will attack you, and these are not exclusive to Bam's Amschand either. One explanation for the Dwemer Spectres is that they are simply ghosts of unfinished business, of Dwemer that died before the final disappearance, therefore they were not connected to whatever mechanism Kagrenac activated. But in Bam's Amschand, these are seemingly the ghosts of the ash piles, instantly disintegrated while going about their day. We can actually interact with one named Radak Stugnathums, and he helps the Nerevarine relight True Flame with Pyroil Tar. But interestingly, he says, "You've got your shiny blade, now leave an old spirit to his haunts." This gives the idea that he is a ghost, like others,
haunting an area after his death. I love the idea that these are some kind of temporal echoes, or like McKenna's Clockwork elves manifesting in slipped, torn space-time, but the evidence just does not support this idea. The spectres, when vanquished, leave behind ectoplasm, just like other ghosts, and again, for most of the spectres, it is sufficient to say that they were simply ghosts of Dwemer who died before the disappearance. But as for the spectres of Bams Amschand, a forensic look at the scene shows these ghosts as results of the instantaneous deaths of its inhabitants. So how can we make sense of this? Well, one possibility is that the inhabitants of this ruin were the result of some kind of error or failure. It could be that the Dwemer of this ruin failed to properly integrate with the Numidium, or to transcend in whatever abstract way the Dwemer might have intended, and so their bodies dissolved but their souls were not properly integrated and hence remained. Perhaps this could be explained easier through the idea that the calling was the mechanism for the disappearance. For example, if there was some interference or a malfunction of one of the Tuathums, the central pylon in the network, it could be that the resonance that was shot through the network didn't transmit properly, or like something to that effect. It is worth noting that Dwemer Spectres are restricted to Vvardenfell, with none found in Skyrim and beyond in Hammerfell or High Rock. The Ghosts of the Tribunal Creation Club content seems to feature one in the ruins of Falbathars on Solstheim, but even so, that is relatively close to Vvardenfell. The Dwarven Spectres of Vvardenfell are a frustrating thing to contend with, leading us to have to make other assumptions to account for them, but still they are not enough to completely dismiss the theories we have laid out. One extra bit of insight comes from the experiments of Arniel Gain, a scholar and mage of the College of Winterhold.
Look, it's all very simple. The Dwemer, they were, masters of magic in a way we can't even begin to conceive of. Their greatest achievement, however, has also been their greatest, shall we say, mystery. What could be worth studying about a long-lost civilization? Their disappearance, of course. Instant, unexplainable. The stories have fascinated me. Ever since I was young, I wanted to know what really happened. After years and years of work, I'm closing in on a way to investigate what happened through experimentation. Only now, well, it's simply a disaster. Without boring you with the details, I'm attempting to recreate the circumstances of the event. The dwarves were very clever, tapping into and drawing power from the heart of Rourken itself. Lacking the heart of a dead god myself, I was attempting to substitute a rather specific soul gem, the one you helped me acquire.
You can help Arniel with this wild experiment, procuring the items he needs, including keening, one of the tools of Kagrenac.
This is not just a dagger. This is a dwarven artifact beyond nearly all value. A singular instrument of immense power. A tool of impossible import. Keening and its counterpart Sunder, used by the tonal architects of the Dwemer to tap into the heart of Rourken. Everyone knows the dwarves disappeared. No one knows why. This little experiment is a first step in recreating the events of their disappearance in an effort to unravel that mystery. Lacking the heart of a dead god, I'm substituting the crystal you helped craft in its place. I also lack Sunder, the counterpart to the dagger Keening. I am reasonably confident, however, that this will still work. I certainly don't expect it to have quite the same results. I'm no tonal architect, of course. Well, I suppose it's time, isn't it? Let's see what happens. You may want to stand back a step or two.
Arniel strikes the soul gem once, twice, 3 times, and there is no result, but then he is angered and strikes more until suddenly a flash of light appears and he is gone, vanished. Keening left on the floor. What happened here? Did he really go the route of the Dwemer? Did he abstract himself into some realm of sub-reality, become part of the Numidium? I don't think so. After this experiment is complete, you gain the unique spell to summon Arniel Gain's Shade. Perhaps this supports the idea that the Dwemer Spectres were the results of a failed integration, a failed transcendence. Arniel's experiment was flawed from the start, given that it had to use a soul gem in place of the Heart of Lorkhan, and 2, he did not have access to Sunder and Wraithguard, the other tools of Kagrenac. Perhaps all Arniel achieved was the halfway point, a physical presence vanquished, his soul parted, but not integrated or unable to reach the destination, whatever that destination may be. For me at least, I think this helps clarify the idea idea that the Spectres of Bam Zamschand are the result of a malfunction of sorts, either because of a mistake due to the hastened actions of Kagrenac or some calling network failing. If this is the case, then the Dwarven Spectres are accounted for, and are far more tragic. Poor Dwemer souls ripped from material existence but due to error left stranded as forever lamenting spirits, lost from their race. I'd encourage you guys to reflect on the long contents of this video and come to your own conclusions about both the mysteries of their origins and their disappearance, as well as the many details about their migrations and histories. But to finish this video off, firstly, I want to thank you guys for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. But secondly, I want to provide you with my abridged version of Dwemer history. I think, like I think about the Falmer, that the Dwemer came from the old Elven kingdom of Altmora, that they were the survivors of Lorkhan's destruction in the Dawn era. I think it would explain the presence of the two unaccounted races of Northern Elves, plus it also explains cause for their divergence, with the Falmer remaining true to Auriel and the Dwemer being the group that felt betrayed by their faith, by the gods, and that is why they turned to their own ingenuity and engineering, scorning the gods that had failed them. These proto-Dwemer went east to Resdayn, splitting from the proto-Falmer, and there they began founding their civilization in the Velothi Mountains and eventually Vvardenfell and the rest of Morrowind itself. In the Middle Merethic era, the Velothi exodus of the Kaimer came to Resdayn and coveted the lands and territory of the Dwemer, establishing their high Velothi culture. I think around this time, the Dwemer may have begun their expansion back towards Skyrim, exploring the vast subterranean reaches. By the late Merethic era, the high Velothi culture collapses and the Kaimer devolve into tribal cultures, proto-houses, and they continue to war with the Dwemer. I'm inclined to think that the warring between the Kaimer and the Dwemer takes a toll on the deep elves of Resdayn, because by contrast, the Dwemer of Skyrim were thriving. They discover Aetherium and enter a 70-ish year golden age of technological innovation, including the marvels of Blackreach, such as the Time Machine of Nchuthancast, or the Orrery which contained the Dark Heart at Arkthzand, or the humanoid Architons powered by Aetherium, and of course the Aetherium Forge itself before it was lost to civil war between the city-states. Meanwhile in Resdayn, the Dwemer and Kaimer are conquered by the Nords and would live under their thumb until Nerevar and Dumak could unite the Kaimer and the Dwemer in the First Council of 1E416. The Aetherium Wars had cost the Dwemer of Skyrim everything, and the city-states had largely collapsed, and reclamation of most of these lands would not have occurred until around the time the Nords were driven out of Morrowind. I personally think that Dumak financed or resourced many of these expeditions, and that these refounded colonies, such as Clan Kragen at Arkthzand, were connected to or part of the Second Empire of the Dwemer. Of course, Clan Rourken at this point had run off to Hammerfell. Peace and prosperity for the First Council. Resdayn is the place to be for the Dwemer. The heart of Lorkhan is discovered and abused by Kagrenac. He tries to build a god, the Numidium. Battle of Red Mountain. The dwarves disappear. Personally, my favorite theory for the disappearance is a kind of synthesis of the Abstraction and Gestalt theories, that through the calling, the Dwemer were exposed to a resonance of the heart of Lorkhan being struck by Kagrenac, enacting a kind of abstraction of all Dwemer souls on Nirn, forcing them into a Gestalt unification within the Numidium. The Numidium is the Dwemer. The Spectres of Bam Zamschand are the result of a failed integration due to some failure of the calling network, or perhaps even some other metaphysical error made in haste. After all, Kagrenac had to act as the Kaimer advanced upon him. For me, that is the fate of the Dwemer. To become an imperfect god engine, a vessel of negation, an entity that is at odds with reality itself, breaking time whenever it walks, denying the existence of reality wherever it goes. I am personally partial to the soul of Coda. That, of course, is my personal interpretation of the Dwemer. Through this monolithic video, I have laid out all of my reasoning and explained contrary ideas, and I really hope you guys found this interesting. There are some ideas that I specifically left out, mainly because I just did not have time to explore these tangents. Sothasil and his Clockwork City will be discussed at some point in a dedicated tribunal video, and things such as the Falmer souls used to power automatons theory has been discussed in our Falmer video linked below, and the Dumalakath connection has been talked about in our Orcs Weirder Than You Think video. Thanks again for watching. Please do comment your insights below. I'd love to hear your ideas. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.